The moment Evelyn Hart realized her future husband didn't want her anymore, she understood that some promises are made to be broken, and some strangers are destined to save your life. This is a story about betrayal, survival, and a love that rewrote destiny on the untamed frontier of 1878 Colorado. A story where one woman's greatest humiliation became the doorway to her truest home. If you stay with me until the end, you'll discover how courage can bloom even in the coldest rejection. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city name so I can see how far this story travels across the world. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The train's whistle cut through the thin mountain air like a blade through silk, announcing Evelyn Hart's arrival in Red Hollow, Colorado, with all the ceremony of a funeral bell. She pressed her gloved hand against the soot-stained window, watching the rough-hewn buildings of the frontier town materialize through the settling dust like ghosts emerging from smoke. The year was 1878, and everything Evelyn had known, everything she had loved, lay buried 3 weeks and 1,000 miles behind her. Her father's death had been swift. The creditors had been swifter. The suitcase at her feet contained all that remained of her former life: 2 dresses, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, a tortoiseshell comb, and a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Those letters had been her salvation, her promise of a future when the walls of her Philadelphia boarding house had closed in like a tomb. Letters from Mr. Silas Crowell, written in careful, measured script, describing a life in Colorado that seemed impossibly distant from the suffocating parlors and whispered scandals of the East. "A good woman deserves a good home," one letter had read. "I can offer you both security and respect. The West is hard, but it rewards those who are willing to work for their happiness." Security, respect, happiness. Evelyn had clung to those words like a drowning woman clings to driftwood. The train lurched to a halt with a shriek of brakes that set her teeth on edge. Through the window, she could see Red Hollow Station, if one could call it that. It was little more than a wooden platform with a sagging roof, flanked by a water tower that leaned slightly to the left as though exhausted by its own existence. Beyond it, the town sprawled in haphazard rows, false-fronted buildings with peeling paint, dirt streets churned to mud by recent rain, and mountains rising in the distance like the ramparts of some vast, indifferent fortress. This was to be her home now, this rough, raw place where the air smelled of pine and horse sweat and possibility. Evelyn gathered her skirts and rose, her legs unsteady after 3 days of rattling across the prairie. The other passengers, a drummer with a battered sample case, 2 miners still wearing the grime of whatever hole they'd crawled from, and a severe-looking woman who'd spent the entire journey eyeing Evelyn with undisguised disapproval, pushed past her toward the exit. The woman paused just long enough to deliver a parting shot. "Mail-order bride, aren't you?" she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I can always tell. You have that desperate look about you." Evelyn's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high. "I prefer to call it hopeful, ma'am." The woman sniffed. "Hope's a luxury out here, girl. You'll learn that soon enough." Then she was gone, disappearing into the knot of passengers disembarking onto the platform, leaving Evelyn alone with her suitcase and her rapidly fragmenting composure. Desperate. The word stung because it was true. She was desperate. Desperate enough to answer an advertisement in the Philadelphia Ledger. Desperate enough to exchange letters with a man she'd never met. Desperate enough to board a westbound train with a one-way ticket and a heart full of fragile, terrifying hope. But she wasn't a fool. She knew the risks. She'd read the stories about mail-order brides who'd arrived to find their promised husbands were drunkards or brutes or already married. She'd prepared herself for disappointment. What she hadn't prepared herself for was the scene that greeted her when she finally stepped onto the platform. 2 men were arguing near the water tower, their voices rising above the general din of the station. One was the station master, a slight man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the nervous energy of a cornered rabbit. The other was... Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained the seams of his work-worn jacket. Dark hair, streaked with early silver at the temples, fell across a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the surrounding mountains. High cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened with several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of a winter storm. He stood with the easy, coiled readiness of a man who'd never backed down from a fight in his life. and he was furious. "I paid for that shipment 3 weeks ago, Henderson," the tall man was saying, his voice low and dangerous. "You're telling me it's not here?" "I'm telling you, Maddox, that the railroad don't answer to me," the station master, Henderson, replied, his voice climbing toward panic. "If the shipment got held up in Denver, there ain't nothing I can do about it. Maybe if you'd order your supplies from the local merchants instead of sending all the way to... The local merchants charge twice what it's worth and deliver half what I pay for." Maddox cut him off. "I'm done getting robbed by Crowell and his cronies just because they're the only game in town." Crowell. Evelyn's heart stuttered. Silas Crowell, her intended. They were talking about him. She wanted to move closer, to hear more, but her feet seemed rooted to the platform. Around her, other passengers were being greeted by family members or heading toward the line of wagons that served as the town's transportation. But Evelyn stood alone, her suitcase growing heavier by the second, watching this stranger, Maddox, tear into the hapless station master with the controlled fury of a summer thunderstorm. "You tell Crowell," Maddox said, his voice dropping to a register that was somehow more threatening than shouting, "that if he thinks he can squeeze every rancher in this valley until we're forced to buy from his overpriced store, he's got another think coming. I'll order from Denver, I'll order from Cheyenne, I'll order from San Francisco if I have to, but I won't be cheated." Henderson was backing away now, hands raised in supplication. "It ain't my concern what you and Silas got between you, Clay. I just work for the railroad." "Then do your job and find my shipment." With that, Maddox turned on his heel and strode away, his boots striking the platform with sharp, angry reports. He passed within 3 feet of Evelyn, close enough that she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hands flexed and released as though he was physically restraining himself from putting his fist through something. He didn't even glance at her. To him, she was just another piece of human furniture cluttering up the platform. But Evelyn couldn't stop staring. There was something about him, something raw and real and utterly unlike the carefully civilized men she'd known back east. He moved like violence contained in skin, like a wolf that had agreed to walk among dogs but never forgotten what it was. She shook herself, tearing her gaze away. This wasn't why she was here. She was here for Silas Crowell, her intended, the man who'd promised her security and respect and a future. Not some angry rancher with a grudge against the local merchants. Evelyn picked up her suitcase and made her way across the platform toward the station house. Inside, Henderson was slumped behind a scarred wooden desk, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "I'm looking for Mr. Silas Crowell. I was told he'd be meeting me here." Henderson looked up, his expression shifting from exhaustion to curiosity. "You're the bride?" The word made her flinch. The bride. As though that was all she was now, a role to be filled, a problem to be solved. "Miss Evelyn Hart," she said firmly. "I've been corresponding with Mr. Crowell for the past 3 months." Henderson's face did something complicated, a flicker of what might have been pity, quickly masked. "Crowell sent word he couldn't make it to the station, said for me to direct you to his store on Main Street, said he'd meet you there." Evelyn's stomach clenched. Couldn't make it to the station? On the day his bride was arriving? The day they'd been planning for months? "I see," she said, though she didn't see at all. "And how do I get to Main Street?" "Straight through town," Henderson said, gesturing vaguely. "Can't miss it. Big sign says Crowell General Store. You need help with that bag?" "No, thank you. I can manage." She could always manage. She'd been managing since her father took to his bed with the illness that would kill him, managing through the creditors and the auction of their furniture and the cold, pitying stares of her father's former friends. She could manage a walk through a frontier town with a heavy suitcase and a heavier heart. Outside, Red Hollow revealed itself in all its rough glory. The main street was a river of mud, crossed by planks that served as makeshift bridges between the boardwalks. Buildings crowded together like gamblers around a card table. A saloon with battered swinging doors, a mercantile with displays of tin goods and work clothes, a blacksmith shop where the clang of hammer on anvil rang out in steady rhythm. Men in dusty boots and worn hats tipped their heads as Evelyn passed, their eyes curious but not unkind. A few women peered out from shop windows, their faces sharp with judgment. The mail-order bride. The desperate Eastern girl who'd come west to sell herself for security. Evelyn kept her eyes forward and her back straight. Let them stare. She'd survived worse than gossip. The Crowell General Store occupied a prime corner lot, its false front rising 2 stories above the surrounding buildings in a transparent attempt at grandeur. Gold lettering proclaimed Crowell General Store, finest goods in Red Hollow. Through the wide front windows, Evelyn could see shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to farming equipment, all displayed with the precise orderliness of a man who valued control. She paused at the door, her hand on the latch, and allowed herself one moment of pure terror. This was it. The moment she'd been imagining, dreading, hoping for, since she'd posted her first letter. Behind this door was the man who would be her husband, the life she'd traveled 1,000 miles to claim. Please, she thought, to no God in particular, please let him be kind. Then she pushed open the door. The interior of the store smelled of leather and coffee and sawdust. It was larger than it had appeared from outside, with aisles of merchandise stretching toward a back room. A pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, unlit in the late spring warmth. Behind a long counter stood a woman, sharp-faced, perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disapproval. And beside her, examining an invoice with the focused attention most men reserve for surveying a battlefield, stood Silas Crowell. Evelyn recognized him from the single photograph he'd sent, a formal portrait taken in a Denver studio, showing a man of perhaps 50 with thinning hair and a neatly trimmed beard. But the photograph hadn't captured the coldness in his pale blue eyes, or the thin, tight line of his mouth. It hadn't shown the way he stood, as though the weight of his own self-importance required extra support from his spine. He looked up as the bell above the door chimed. His gaze traveled over Evelyn with the assessing quality of a man examining livestock at auction. "Miss Hart, I presume," he said. His voice was dry, colorless, nothing like the warmth his letters had conveyed. "Mr. Crowell." Evelyn crossed the floor toward the counter, her suitcase bumping against her leg with each step. "I'm so pleased to finally meet you in person." The lie tasted like ashes in her mouth. Silas set down the invoice with precise care. "Yes. Well, your train was late. Only by half an hour. The conductor said there was a delay and—" "This is my sister, Miss Prudence Crowell," Silas interrupted, gesturing to the sharp-faced woman. "She manages the store with me." Prudence didn't offer a greeting, just subjected Evelyn to the same cold evaluation her brother had performed. "She's thinner than you described, Silas." Heat flooded Evelyn's cheeks. "The journey was long. I'm afraid I didn't have much appetite for—" "Prudence, why don't you check the stockroom?" Silas said. "I need a moment with Miss Hart." For an instant, something passed between the siblings, some unspoken communication that made Evelyn's stomach twist with foreboding. Then Prudence nodded and disappeared through a door behind the counter, her skirts rustling with stiff disapproval. Silence settled over the store like dust. Silas cleared his throat. "Miss Hart, Evelyn. I fear we need to have a frank conversation." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the handle of her suitcase. "Of course. Well, when I first placed my advertisement, my circumstances were different." He wouldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on a point somewhere over her left shoulder. "I was living alone in the house behind the store. I felt it was time to marry, to establish a proper household." Was, felt, past tense. Every word landed like a stone in water, sending ripples of dread through Evelyn's chest. "However," Silas continued, "circumstances have changed. 3 weeks ago, my sister's husband passed away rather suddenly. She found herself without means or home. Naturally, I invited her to come live with me. She arrived 2 weeks ago and has been a tremendous help with the store." Evelyn's mind was racing ahead, seeing the conclusion before he spoke it, already feeling the ground crumbling beneath her feet. "You see, with Prudence managing the household, I find I no longer require. That is, the need for a wife has become less pressing." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. "I don't understand," Evelyn said, though she understood perfectly. "We had an agreement. We've been corresponding for months. I sold everything I owned to purchase my train ticket. Yes, I understand this is inconvenient," Silas said, waving his hand as though dismissing an overcharge on an invoice. I'm prepared to offer compensation for your trouble. I'll purchase a return ticket for you on tomorrow's eastbound train. You'll have a full refund of your passage, plus an additional $50 for your inconvenience. That's more than fair, I should think. $50. He was offering her $50 as though that could replace the life he'd promised, the future she'd staked everything on. Mr. Crowell, Evelyn said, fighting to keep her voice steady, I don't have anything to return to. My father is dead. His debts consumed everything. The only reason I came west was because your letters promised. My letters promised nothing legally binding, Silas cut her off, his voice hardening. They were expressions of intent, not a contract. Surely you understand that circumstances change. A man has a right to alter his plans when his situation shifts. And what about my situation? The words came out louder than Evelyn intended, edged with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. What about the fact that I've traveled across the country based on your assurances, that I have nowhere else to go? Silas's expression flickered, not with sympathy, but with irritation, as though she was being deliberately difficult about a simple business transaction. That's hardly my fault, Miss Hart. If you've made yourself destitute, that's a result of your own poor planning. I'm offering you a generous solution. I suggest you accept it with grace. The dismissal in his voice, the casual cruelty of it, struck Evelyn like a physical blow. She'd known disappointment. She'd known loss. But this calculated betrayal, this reduction of her entire life to an inconvenience that could be solved with money, this was something new and terrible. She opened her mouth to respond, to argue, to do something other than stand there like a fool when the bell above the door chimed again. Well, Silas, a familiar voice drawled, I see you've finally decided to show up for your own bride. Evelyn turned to find the angry rancher from the station, Maddox, filling the doorway. He'd removed his hat, revealing dark hair that was slightly too long, curling over his collar in a way that suggested he didn't much care about fashion. In the confines of the store, he seemed even larger, his presence commanding the space with an effortless authority that made Silas look like exactly what he was, a small man playing at importance. This is a private conversation, Clay, Silas said, his voice tight. Didn't look private, what with you loudly explaining to this lady how you're throwing her back like an undersized fish. Clay's storm-gray eyes moved to Evelyn, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Red Hollow, someone actually seemed to see her, not as a problem or a commodity, but as a person. Miss, you all right? The unexpected kindness in the question nearly undid her. Evelyn straightened her spine, refusing to let these men see her break. I'm quite well, thank you, Mr. Maddox, Clay Maddox. I run the Circle M ranch about 5 miles north of town. He looked back at Silas. So you brought this woman all the way from... Where'd you come from, miss? Philadelphia, Evelyn said. Philadelphia, Clay repeated, his jaw tightening. You brought her all the way from Philadelphia with promises of marriage, and now you're what? Sending her back because your sister moved in? My arrangement with Miss Hart is none of your concern, Silas said, spots of color appearing on his cheeks. See, that's where you're wrong. Clay stepped fully into the store, his boots loud on the wooden floor. When a man gives his word, puts it in writing, sends it across the country, convinces a woman to uproot her entire life, that word means something. That's honor, Silas. But I guess you wouldn't know much about that, would you? How dare you? I dare, because somebody needs to say it. Clay's voice never rose, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. You've been bleeding this town dry for years, charging twice what goods are worth, because you're the only store for 30 miles. You've squeezed every rancher and farmer until we can barely break even. And now you're doing the same thing to this woman, using her, then discarding her when she's no longer convenient. Silas's face had gone from pink to deep red. Get out of my store. Gladly. I just came in to buy nails, but I've lost my appetite for giving you money. Clay turned to Evelyn. Miss Hart, would you walk outside with me for a moment? I'd like a word if you're willing. Every instinct Evelyn had cultivated in Philadelphia, every lesson in propriety and reputation screamed at her to refuse. A respectable woman didn't go off alone with strange men, especially not rough-edged ranchers who looked like they'd been carved from violence and stone. But Philadelphia was 1,000 miles away, and its rules had already failed her. "Yes," she said, "I'd be happy to." She picked up her suitcase, ignoring Silas's spluttered protests, and followed Clay Maddox out into the fading afternoon light. The offer. The boardwalk outside Crowell's store was empty, the other townspeople having retreated to their homes or businesses as the dinner hour approached. Clay led Evelyn a few doors down, stopping in front of the darkened window of a dress shop, where their conversation wouldn't be overheard. He didn't speak immediately, just stood looking out at the muddy street, his profile sharp against the golden light. Evelyn waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind still reeling from the scene in the store. Finally, Clay said, "You got any money besides what Silas offered you?" The directness of the question should have offended her. Instead, Evelyn found it oddly refreshing after Silas's calculated doublespeak. $11.30, she said. "That's what's left after my train ticket and meals during the journey." Clay nodded slowly. "Family back east?" "None living." "Friends who'd take you in?" Evelyn thought of the women who'd visited her father during his illness, bringing casseroles and sympathy in equal measure. The same women who'd stopped visiting the moment his debts became public. The same women who'd whispered behind their fans about how tragic it was, how unfortunate, how appropriate that Evelyn Hart was being sent west where her shame wouldn't taint their daughters. "No," she said quietly. "No friends." Clay was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What skills you got?" "I beg your pardon?" "Skills," he repeated, looking at her now, those winter storm eyes direct and assessing. "What can you do? Can you cook? Clean? Manage a household?" "I ran my father's house for 5 years after my mother passed," Evelyn said, lifting her chin. "I can cook for a family of 10, manage a household budget, supervise staff. I can read and write, keep account books, and I've taught basic letters to the children at our church. I can sew, though not fancy work. I can garden. I can—" "Whoa!" A hint of something that might have been amusement flickered across Clay's face. "I'm not interrogating you, Miss Hart. I'm trying to figure out if I've got a solution to your problem." "My problem?" "You need work. I need a housekeeper." The words were so unexpected that for a moment Evelyn just stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "A housekeeper," she repeated. "My last one quit 3 months ago," Clay said. "Couldn't handle the isolation. The ranch is 5 miles out of town, which might as well be 50 for some folks. Since then, I've been living like a bachelor, and the house shows it. I can pay $40 a month plus room and board. You'd have your own room separate from the bunkhouse and the main house. 3 square meals a day. Safe, respectable work." $40 a month. That was more than she'd made teaching piano lessons to the daughters of Philadelphia merchants. More than she'd dared hope for when she'd first considered coming west. But it was also a position with a single man, living under his roof, miles from town. The impropriety of it would have scandalized every woman she'd known back east. Then again, she'd already crossed the line of respectability when she'd answered Silas's advertisement. What did she have left to lose? "Why?" she asked. "Why would you offer this to a complete stranger?" Clay's jaw tightened. "Because I know what it's like to have everything pulled out from under you. And because watching Silas treat you like damaged goods made me so angry, I wanted to put my fist through his face." He paused. "I didn't, though, in case you were wondering." "I noticed," Evelyn said, and felt a smile tug at her lips despite everything. Remarkable self-control. "My mother raised me to be civilized. Doesn't always take, but I try. He shifted his weight, and Evelyn realized he was uncomfortable. This wasn't a man accustomed to making speeches or explaining himself. "Look, Miss Hart, I'm not a saint. I'm offering you work because I need help and you need a job. It's a business arrangement, same as what you had with Silas, except I'll actually honor my end of it." "For how long?" 3 months, guaranteed. After that, if it's working out, we can extend it. If not, you'll have saved enough to get yourself set up somewhere else. Denver maybe, or one of the bigger towns where there's more opportunities for a woman on her own. 3 months. 90 days to figure out what came next, to build a life from the ashes of the one she'd thought she was coming to claim. Evelyn looked at Clay Maddox, really looked at him. He was rough, yes, and clearly angry at the world in general, and Silas Crowell in particular. But there was something solid about him, something that reminded her of her father before the illness, when he'd been strong and certain and protective. Besides, what choice did she have? Take Silas's money and return to Philadelphia, where there was nothing waiting for her but boarding houses and factory work and the slow, grinding poverty that killed women like her in their 30s? Stay in Red Hollow and try to find work in a town where the only employer was the man who'd just rejected her? Or take a chance on this stranger who'd defended her honor without even knowing her name? "I have conditions," Evelyn said. Clay's eyebrows rose. "All right, let's hear them." "I want a written contract, terms spelled out clearly, wages, duties, duration." "Fair enough." "I want my own space. You said a separate room. I want it to have a lock on the door." Something flickered in Clay's eyes. Not offense, but understanding. "The old housekeeper's cabin is about 50 yards from the main house. One room, a stove, a decent bed, door locks from the inside. That work?" Evelyn nodded. "And I want to be paid weekly, not monthly. I don't know you well enough to trust that you'll still be around in 30 days. For the first time, Clay smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face, softening the harsh lines and lighting his eyes with something warm. "You're a sharp one, aren't you, Miss Hart?" "I've learned to be, Mr. Maddox." "Weekly pay it is." He extended his hand. "So, we have an agreement?" Evelyn looked at his hand, work roughened, scarred across the knuckles, strong enough to break her if he chose to. Then she looked at his face, at the unexpected kindness there, and made her decision. She placed her hand in his. "We have an agreement," she said. His grip was firm but careful, and he shook her hand once before releasing it. "I've got a wagon at the livery," Clay said. "If you're ready, we can head out to the ranch before dark, or if you'd rather wait until morning." "Now," Evelyn said. "I'd like to leave now." She didn't want to spend another minute in this town, didn't want to risk seeing Silas or his sister or any of the other people who'd already decided who she was and what she was worth. "Now it is," Clay said. He reached for her suitcase, but Evelyn held on. "I can carry my own bag, Mr. Maddox." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Reckon you can, Miss Hart. Reckon you can." They walked through Red Hollow in the lengthening shadows, past the saloon where piano music had started up, past the church with its white-painted steeple, past the boarding house where other mail-order brides might have stayed while waiting for their weddings. People watched them pass, the rough rancher and the Eastern woman, and Evelyn could feel the speculation burning in their stares. Let them stare. Let them wonder. She was done caring what strangers thought of her choices. The livery stable sat at the edge of town, a sprawling structure that smelled of hay and horses and leather. Clay's wagon was already hitched, a sturdy farm wagon with a single bench seat and a bed full of supplies covered with canvas. 2 draft horses stood in the traces, solid animals with patient eyes. Clay loaded Evelyn's suitcase into the back, then helped her up onto the bench. His hands on her waist were brief, impersonal, but still Evelyn felt heat flood her face. She wasn't used to being touched, even in such ordinary ways. Clay swung up beside her, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses leaned into their harnesses, and the wagon lurched forward. Red Hollow fell away behind them as they followed a rutted road that led north into the hills. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep, burning gold. The air grew cooler, sharp with the scent of pine and sage. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried. They rode in silence for the first mile. Then Clay said, without looking at her, "You should know something, Miss Hart. The reason my last housekeeper quit." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "All right." She said the ranch was too isolated, too quiet, but that wasn't the whole truth. Clay's hands flexed on the reins. "She quit because I've got trouble brewing, trouble with rustlers." "Rustlers?" "Cattle thieves. There's a gang operating in the valley. They've hit 3 ranches in the last 2 months, including mine. Took 20 head last time. The sheriff's worse than useless. He's in Silas's pocket, won't do anything that might upset the town's leading merchant. So we're on our own out there. Is it dangerous? Evelyn asked. Could be, Clay said honestly. Probably will be before it's done. If that changes your mind about coming out to the Circle M, I'll understand. I can take you back, put you up at the boarding house for the night. Evelyn thought about that, about the safe option, the sensible option. Then she thought about the look in Silas's eyes when he told her she'd made herself destitute through her own poor planning, the casual dismissal, the assumption that she'd just accept whatever scraps he threw her and be grateful. No, she said. I'm not going back. Clay glanced at her, something like respect flickering in his expression. You sure? I'm sure. Even knowing there might be trouble? Mr. Maddox, Evelyn said, I just traveled 1,000 miles to marry a man who decided I was inconvenient. I think I can handle some trouble. Clay's mouth quirked. I reckon you can at that, Miss Hart. The road climbed higher into the hills, following a creek that ran silver in the fading light. The land opened up, rolling grassland dotted with cattle, fence lines stretching toward distant tree lines, the mountains rising like sentinels. It was beautiful in a way that made Evelyn's chest ache. Beautiful and harsh, and utterly unlike the manicured parks and paved streets of Philadelphia. This was the West, raw and unforgiving and honest in its dangers. She'd expected to hate it. Instead, she felt something loosening in her chest, some tension she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it was there. There, Clay said, pointing ahead. That's the Circle M. The ranch appeared as they crested a rise, a collection of buildings clustered in a valley carved by the creek. The main house was larger than Evelyn had expected, a 2-story structure built of logs and stone with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Near it stood a barn, several outbuildings, corrals, and what must have been the bunkhouse. Smoke rose from one of the chimneys, and lantern light glowed in a few windows. It looked like a home. A real home. The wagon rattled down the slope toward the ranch yard. As they approached, several men emerged from the bunkhouse. Ranch hands, Evelyn assumed, wearing the rough clothes of working cowboys. They stopped when they saw her, surprise clear on their weather-beaten faces. Clay pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the main house and jumped down. Evening, boys. This is Miss Evelyn Hart. She's going to be our new housekeeper. The men exchanged glances. Then an older cowboy with a graying beard stepped forward. Ma'am, he said, tipping his hat. Name's Jake Thornton. I'm the foreman here. A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thornton, Evelyn said. These are the rest of the hands, Clay said, gesturing to the other men. Tom, Pete, young Danny there. They bunk together, eat together, and work together. You'll be cooking for all of us, if that's agreeable. Of course, Evelyn said, though the thought of cooking for 6 men made her slightly dizzy. Clay lifted her suitcase from the wagon. Let me show you to your cabin. He led her across the yard to a small structure that sat slightly apart from the other buildings. A simple one-room cabin with a narrow porch and a single window. Clay pushed open the door and stepped inside to light a lamp. Warm light filled the space, revealing a surprisingly cozy interior. A narrow bed with a quilt, a small table and chair, a pot-bellied stove, and a trunk for storage. Simple, but clean. It's not much, Clay said, setting her suitcase on the bed, but it's warm and dry. You'll have privacy here. Evelyn stepped inside, running her hand along the edge of the table. It's perfect. Clay pulled a key from his pocket and showed her how the door lock worked, then handed it to her. You're the only one with a key to this cabin, Miss Hart. Not me, not the hands. This is your space. The gesture, the thoughtfulness of it, made Evelyn's throat tight. Thank you, she managed. You're welcome. Clay moved toward the door, then paused. I should warn you, the house is a disaster. I haven't properly cleaned it in 3 months. Tomorrow's soon enough to start work, though. Tonight, just settle in. I'll have Jake bring you some dinner in about an hour. Mr. Maddox, Evelyn said, and he turned back. Why did you really offer me this job? He was quiet for a long moment, his face shadowed in the lamplight. Because when I was 17, he said finally, my father died and left debts that took everything we had. I watched my mother beg for help from people who turned her away because helping would have been inconvenient. I swore I'd never be that person, Never turn away someone who needed help when I had the means to give it. The honesty in his voice, the old pain barely hidden beneath the surface, struck something deep in Evelyn's heart. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your mother. She survived, became tougher than boot leather, and raised me to pay my debts and keep my word." Clay's mouth quirked. "Didn't always succeed at making me a gentleman, but she tried. I think you're more of a gentleman than many men who claim the title Mr. Maddox." Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or pleasure. "That's kind of you to say, Miss Hart. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll draw up that contract you wanted." Then he was gone, leaving Evelyn alone in her cabin with a lamp burning golden and the sound of the creek murmuring in the darkness outside. She sank onto the bed, her legs suddenly weak, and realized she was shaking. Not with fear or regret, but with something that felt dangerously close to hope. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd left Philadelphia. It wasn't the safe, respectable marriage Silas's letters had promised. But as Evelyn lay back on the quilt and stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, she thought that maybe, just maybe, this was something better, something she'd chosen for herself, something real. Evelyn woke to darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. The mattress felt wrong. The sounds were all unfamiliar, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke instead of the coal dust and damp that had permeated her Philadelphia boarding house. Then memory flooded back. The train, the station, Silas's cold dismissal, Clay Maddox's unexpected offer, the Circle M Ranch, her new home, at least for the next 3 months. She fumbled for the matches on the bedside table and lit the lamp, its warm glow pushing back the darkness. Through the cabin's single window, she could see the first pale hints of dawn touching the eastern sky. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed with aggressive enthusiasm, and she heard the low murmur of men's voices, the ranch hands beginning their day. Evelyn rose and dressed quickly in the dim light, choosing the more practical of her 2 dresses, a simple gray wool that had seen her through the last year of her father's illness. She twisted her hair into a knot at the base of her neck, splashed cold water from the basin onto her face, and regarded herself in the small mirror hanging above the washstand. She looked tired. Shadows pooled beneath her eyes, and her face seemed thinner than it had been even a week ago. But there was something else there too, a spark of determination that hadn't existed in Philadelphia, where every day had been about survival and every decision had been made from desperation. Here, she'd made a choice. It might have been born from necessity, but it was still hers. Evelyn pulled on her worn coat, the morning air held a chill that penetrated even the cabin's sturdy walls, and stepped outside. The ranch was coming alive in the pre-dawn light. Lanterns glowed in the bunkhouse windows, and smoke rose from multiple chimneys. In the corrals, horses stamped and snorted, their breath visible in the cold air. The mountains to the west were still dark silhouettes against a sky that was shifting from black to deep blue to the palest gold. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. "Morning, Miss Hart?" Evelyn turned to find Jake Thornton approaching, a steaming cup in his weathered hands. The foreman looked like he'd been awake for hours, his eyes alert despite the early hour. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton," Evelyn said. "Jake, please. We don't stand much on formality out here." He offered her the cup. "Coffee. Figured you might need it. Takes some getting used to the altitude. Makes folks tired at first." The kindness in the gesture warmed her more than the coffee did when she accepted it gratefully. "Thank you, Jake. That's very thoughtful. Boss said you'd be taking over the cooking starting today. Just wanted to let you know, we're not particular. Anything's better than what we've been eating, mostly beans and whatever Pete doesn't burn on the bunkhouse stove." Jake's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Pete's a fine hand with cattle, but he cooks like he's trying to poison us." "I'll do my best," Evelyn said. "Where's the main kitchen?" "In the big house. I'll show you." Jake gestured toward the 2-story structure that dominated the ranch yard. "Fair warning, though, it's a mess. Clay's been living like a wild animal since Marta left." Evelyn followed Jake across the yard, sipping the strong, bitter coffee and trying not to think too hard about what she'd agreed to. Cooking for 6 men, managing a household she'd never seen, working for a man she'd met less than 24 hours ago. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something that might have been excitement stirring beneath her nervousness. Jake pushed open the front door of the main house, and Evelyn stepped inside. The interior was dim, the curtains still drawn against the morning. Jake moved through the space with practiced ease, opening curtains and lighting lamps, revealing a home that had clearly once been cared for but had since fallen into comfortable disorder. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. A sofa covered in worn leather, several wooden chairs, a desk piled with papers and account books. Coats hung from pegs near the door, muddy boots were scattered across the floor, and every surface seemed to be covered with the detritus of bachelor living: coffee cups, newspapers, tools, rope. "Kitchen's through here," Jake said, leading her through a doorway. The kitchen was spacious, with a large cast-iron stove, a long wooden table scarred from use, open shelves holding dishes and cookware, and a pump sink beneath a window that looked out over the corrals. It was also, as Jake had warned, a disaster. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink and stacked on the table. Pots with the remains of burned food sat on the stove. The floor needed sweeping, the counters needed scrubbing, and something in the corner smelled decidedly unpleasant. Evelyn set down her coffee cup and surveyed the chaos with the practiced eye of someone who'd managed a household through poverty and illness. "Well," she said, "I suppose I should get started." Jake's expression shifted to something like respect. "You need anything? You just holler. The boys and I will be working the north pasture today, but Clay should be around. He's usually in the barn this time of morning, checking on a mare that's close to foaling." After Jake left, Evelyn stood in the silent kitchen and let herself feel the full weight of the task ahead. Then she rolled up her sleeves, tied an apron she found hanging on a hook, and began to work. She started with the stove, scraping out the burned remnants and ashes, then building a proper fire. While the stove heated, she pumped water into every available pot and set them to boil. Then she tackled the dishes, scrubbing away weeks of accumulated grime until her hands were red and her back ached. The window above the sink showed her the sun rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that she never would have seen from her Philadelphia boarding house. She was elbow-deep in soapy water when the back door opened and Clay Maddox walked in. He stopped short when he saw her, surprise flickering across his face. "Miss Hart, you didn't have to start this early." "I'm an early riser, mister." "Maddox," Evelyn said, not looking up from the dish she was scrubbing. "And as Jake kindly pointed out, there's a considerable amount of work to be done." Clay moved into the kitchen, and Evelyn was suddenly aware of how small the space felt with him in it. He dominated it the same way he dominated Silas's store, not through aggression, but through sheer presence. "I know it's bad," he said, sounding almost apologetic. "I kept meaning to clean up, but the days get away from me out here." "It's nothing I haven't dealt with before," Evelyn said. She rinsed the dish and set it on the drying rack, then finally looked at him. "My father was ill for the last year of his life, bedridden. I learned to manage a household with very little help." Something shifted in Clay's expression, understanding perhaps, or sympathy. "I'm sorry, that must have been hard." "It was." Evelyn reached for another dish, "but it taught me that there's very little I can't handle if I put my mind to it." Clay was quiet for a moment, watching her work. Then he said, "I've got that contract drawn up. Figured we could go over it after breakfast, if that suits you." "That would be fine. What time do the men usually eat?" 6:30. Gives them time to get started on their chores before the heat of the day." Clay paused. "Don't suppose you've had breakfast yourself?" "Not yet." "Well, don't let me stop you from making something. I eat pretty much anything that's not actively trying to kill me." Despite herself, Evelyn smiled. "I'll see what I can manage." She'd found a larder off the kitchen stocked with basics: flour, salt, bacon, eggs, a crock of butter, dried beans, preserved vegetables. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had to work with during the lean months in Philadelphia. Within 30 minutes, she had bacon sizzling on the stove, eggs frying, and biscuits browning in the oven. Clay had settled at the kitchen table, ostensibly reviewing some paperwork, but Evelyn caught him watching her several times as she moved around the kitchen. It should have made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being observed while she worked. But there was nothing predatory in his gaze. He seemed more curious than anything else, as though trying to figure out this woman who'd appeared on his doorstep with a suitcase and a spine of steel. When the food was ready, she set a plate in front of him without ceremony. Clay looked at the perfectly cooked eggs, the crisp bacon, the golden biscuits, and something in his face went soft. "Miss Hart," he said quietly, "when was the last time someone cooked you breakfast?" The question caught her off guard. I don't remember." "Then sit down and eat with me, please." It was the please that did it, the unexpected courtesy from this rough-edged man. Evelyn filled a plate for herself and sat across from him at the scarred wooden table. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes. Then Clay said, "You asked me yesterday why I really offered you this job." "You answered me," Evelyn said. "Your mother—" "That was part of it," Clay interrupted. "But there's more." He set down his fork, his jaw tightening. "My wife died 6 years ago. Fever took her in 3 days. We'd only been married 8 months. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with old grief. "I'm so sorry," Evelyn said softly. "After Sarah died, I shut myself off. Threw myself into the ranch, into work, into anything that would keep me from thinking about what I'd lost. I let this house fall apart because taking care of it reminded me too much of when she was alive, when she'd fuss over curtains and insist on fresh flowers on the table." Clay's voice was rough. "When I saw you standing in Silas's store yesterday, being dismissed like you didn't matter, I saw Sarah. Not physically. You don't look anything alike. But I saw that same determination to survive. That same refusal to break even when everything's falling apart. And I couldn't walk away." Evelyn's throat was tight. "You honor her memory by helping others." "I try to. Doesn't always work out, but I try." Clay met her eyes. "I want you to know, Miss Hart, that this is a business arrangement. I'm not looking to replace Sarah. I'm not looking for anything beyond honest work for honest pay. You'll be safe here." "I believe you," Evelyn said, and realized she meant it. Clay pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "The contract. Everything we discussed yesterday. Wages, terms, duties. I had Tom witness it. He's the only one of the hands who can read proper. You can take time to review it, or we can go through it together now." Evelyn took the paper and read it carefully. The terms were exactly as Clay had stated. $40 per month paid weekly, room and board provided, duties to include cooking and general housekeeping. The contract was for 3 months with option to extend by mutual agreement. There was even a clause specifying that Evelyn's living quarters were private and not to be entered without her express permission. It was more generous, more protective than any employment contract she'd ever seen. "This is acceptable," she said. She found a pen on the desk in the main room and signed her name in her careful script. Clay signed below her signature, his handwriting bold and decisive. "Welcome to the Circle M, Miss Hart," he said, extending his hand. This time when she shook it, Evelyn felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness that she hadn't felt since before her father's illness. Over the next week, Evelyn transformed the main house from a bachelor's chaos into something approaching order. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed, washed curtains that hadn't been touched in months, organized the chaotic pantry, and imposed a strict rule about muddy boots that the ranch hands grumbled about, but ultimately accepted. The men were rough, but respectful. Jake, the foreman, treated her with grandfatherly courtesy. Pete and Tom, both in their 30s, were quiet men who spoke more to horses than to people, but always tipped their hats when they saw her. Young Danny, barely 18, blushed crimson whenever Evelyn spoke to him, and stammered his thanks for every meal. Clay was different. He was polite, always proper, but Evelyn sensed him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. Not with improper intentions. She'd grown skilled at recognizing that kind of attention from the men who'd circled like vultures after her father's death, but with something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just the natural wariness of a man who'd been hurt and was testing the waters of trust. They fell into a rhythm. Clay rose before dawn to work with the horses, often missing breakfast entirely. Evelyn would save him a plate that he'd eat cold at noon while standing in the barn. The ranch hands took their midday meal in the bunkhouse, but they all gathered in the main house kitchen for supper, crowding around the long table with appetites that amazed Evelyn. She'd been at the Circle M for 8 days when the fragile peace shattered. It started with Danny bursting through the kitchen door at mid-morning, his young face pale with panic. "Miss Hart, you gotta come quick! It's Tom! There's been an accident!" Evelyn's heart lurched. She grabbed a clean dish towel and ran after Danny across the ranch yard toward the barn. Inside, she found Clay kneeling beside Tom, who was sprawled on the hay-strewn floor with his shirt soaked in blood. "What happened?" Evelyn demanded, dropping to her knees beside them. "Horse spooked," Jake said from somewhere behind her. Tom got caught between the animal and the stall door, kicked him in the ribs, then when he fell, sliced his arm open on something sharp. Clay's face was grim. "We need to get him to the doctor in town." "That's an hour-round trip," Evelyn said, her mind already racing through what she knew, what she'd learned during her father's illness when doctors had been too expensive and she'd had to manage on her own. "Let me see the wound." "Miss Hart, this ain't Let me see it," she said, her voice sharp with authority. Clay hesitated, then carefully peeled back Tom's shirt. The gash ran from Tom's shoulder nearly to his elbow, deep and bleeding heavily. But it was clean, no dirt, no debris. Around it, his ribs were already purpling with bruises that would be spectacular by morning. "Tom," Evelyn said, leaning over so he could see her face. "Can you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," Tom gasped. "Hurts like hell." "I know it does. I need to check your ribs. This is going to hurt more." She pressed carefully along his rib cage, watching his face for reactions. When she reached the left side, Tom's breath hissed between his teeth. "Cracked. Maybe broken," Evelyn said. "But not displaced. I can't feel any shifting. The arm is worse. It needs stitching." "I'll ride for the doctor," Danny said. "No." Evelyn looked at Clay. "I can do it. I've done it before." Clay's eyes widened. "You've stitched wounds?" "My father fell on ice during his illness, cut his head open. The doctor wanted $5 we didn't have, so I did it myself." She met Clay's gaze steadily. "I know what I'm doing, but it's Tom's choice." Tom looked between them, his face gray with pain. "How bad you gonna hurt me, Miss Hart?" "Considerably," Evelyn said honestly, "but I'll be as quick as I can, and you'll heal clean if I do it right." Tom's jaw tightened. "All right, do it." "Jake, I need whiskey," Evelyn said. "Danny, get me clean cloths. As many as you can find. Clay, boil water. Oil. And someone find me a needle and thread." The men scattered to obey, and Evelyn was left alone with Tom. She took his good hand in hers. "You're going to be all right," she said quietly. "I promise you, I'm not going to let you die on this barn floor." "Weren't planning on it, ma'am," Tom said, and managed a weak smile. By the time the men returned with her supplies, Evelyn had transformed from nervous housekeeper into something harder, more focused. She'd learned this during her father's illness, how to push emotion aside, how to do what needed doing without flinching. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and whiskey, ignoring Tom's bitten-off curses. The needle had to be sterilized in the fire, the thread boiled. Her hands were steady as she threaded the needle, steadier than she'd expected. "Clay," she said, not looking up, "I need you to hold his shoulders. Jake, his legs. This is going to be bad." "Miss Hart," Clay started. "Do it," she said. "Now." They obeyed. Evelyn took a breath, said a silent prayer to no one in particular, and began to sew. Tom's scream echoed through the barn, but the men held him still. Evelyn worked with methodical precision, each stitch small and even, pulling the edges of the wound together. Her father had screamed too that day on the ice. She'd learned to shut out the sound, to focus only on the work. It took 20 minutes to close the gash. When she finally tied off the last stitch and sat back, her hands were shaking and her dress was spotted with Tom's blood. "Done," she said hoarsely. Tom had passed out somewhere around the 10th stitch. Evelyn checked his pulse, steady, then looked at his ribs. "We need to bind these," she said. "Keep them stable while they heal, and he needs to stay still for at least a week. No riding, no heavy work." "I'll see to it," Jake said. His voice was rough with emotion. "Miss Hart, that was something." Evelyn looked at Clay. His face was unreadable, but something blazed in his eyes. "Help me move him to the bunkhouse," Clay said. "Carefully. Jake, ride to town and fetch the doctor anyway. I want him to check Miss Hart's work." It's good work, Jake said, but I'll fetch him if you want. They carried Tom to his bunk, settled him with surprising gentleness, and Jake rode off toward town. Danny volunteered to sit with Tom until he woke. Evelyn gathered her supplies and walked back to the main house on legs that felt like water. Clay followed her. In the kitchen, Evelyn went to the pump and began washing the blood from her hands. She scrubbed and scrubbed, but her hands kept shaking, and the blood seemed to have stained more than just her skin. "Miss Hart." Clay's voice was gentle. "Evelyn." The use of her first name broke something in her. She turned to him and suddenly she was crying, great gasping sobs that she couldn't control. All the fear she'd pushed aside, all the terror of what might have happened if she'd made a mistake, all the memories of her father's pain came flooding back. Clay's arms came around her strong and sure, pulling her against his chest. He didn't say anything, just held her while she shook apart. "I'm sorry," Evelyn gasped against his shirt. "I'm so sorry. I don't usually—" "Hush," Clay said, his voice rumbling through his chest. "You just saved Tom's life. You're allowed to fall apart a little. What if I'd been wrong? What if I'd hurt him worse? But you didn't. You were calm and capable and braver than most men I know." Clay's hand moved to her back, a steady, grounding pressure. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Necessity," Evelyn said. She pulled back slightly, wiping at her eyes. "When you can't afford doctors, you learn to be your own. I read medical books from the library, practiced stitching on old leather. My father's head wound was the first time I did it on a person." "And you never told anyone you had this skill?" "It's not exactly something you put in a letter to a prospective husband." Evelyn's laugh was shaky. "Dear Mr. Crowell, I can cook, clean, and perform minor surgery. Please send train fare." Clay's mouth quirked. He wouldn't have appreciated you anyway. They stood there in the kitchen, close enough that Evelyn could feel the warmth radiating from Clay's body, could smell the scent of horses and leather and something uniquely him. It should have been improper. It should have made her uncomfortable. Instead, it felt safe. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me. With Tom." "You didn't give me much choice," Clay said, but there was warmth in his voice. "You just took over like a general directing troops." "I was terrified." "Couldn't tell. You looked like you'd done it 100 times." Evelyn stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they'd been standing. Clay's arms dropped away immediately, and she felt the loss of that warmth like a physical thing. "I should check on Tom," she said. "Doctor should be here soon. Let him sleep until then." Clay hesitated. "You did good today, Evelyn. Better than good. You probably saved his arm, maybe his life." The praise warmed her more than it should have. It was just basic medical care. Out here, there's no such thing as just basic medical care. Skills like yours are worth their weight in gold. Clay's expression grew serious. "I'm going to pay you extra this week." "Hazard pay." "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Clay said firmly. "You went above and beyond your duties as a housekeeper. You should be compensated for it." Evelyn wanted to argue, but she recognized the stubborn set to his jaw. She'd seen it before, when he'd argued with Silas at the store. This was a man who kept his word and paid his debts. "All right," she said. "Thank you." The doctor arrived an hour later, examined Tom with the care of a man who'd seen plenty of frontier injuries, and pronounced Evelyn's work better than competent, possibly better than I could have done myself with the available materials. Tom woke that evening, groggy but alive. Within 3 days, he was sitting up and complaining about being kept in bed. Within a week, he was back to light work, his arm healing clean and straight. The incident changed something at the Circle M. The ranch hands, who'd been respectful but distant, now treated Evelyn with something approaching reverence. Danny called her Doc Hart until she made him stop. Even Gruff Pete smiled when he saw her. But it was Clay's behavior that shifted most noticeably. He started joining them for breakfast, arriving in the kitchen just as Evelyn was pulling biscuits from the oven. He'd linger over coffee, asking about her plans for the day, sharing news from the ranch. Sometimes in the evenings, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, he'd sit at the kitchen table while Evelyn prepared the next day's bread, and they'd talk. She learned that he'd inherited the Circle M from his father, that he'd built it from a struggling operation into one of the most successful ranches in the valley. She learned that he loved the land with a fierce, protective passion, that he read poetry late at night when he couldn't sleep, that he'd wanted children with Sarah, but the fever had taken her before they'd had the chance. In turn, Evelyn found herself sharing pieces of her own story. Her mother's death when she was 12, the slow deterioration of her father's health and fortune, the humiliation of watching their possessions auctioned off to pay debts, the desperate, frightening decision to answer Silas's advertisement. "Do you regret it?" Clay asked one evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset behind the mountains. "Coming west?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "I regret what brought me here. My father's death, the debts, Silas's betrayal, but I don't regret being here, at the Circle M." She looked at him. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Clay said. His eyes were very gray in the fading light. "Sometimes the worst things lead us to exactly where we're supposed to be." 3 weeks into her employment, Evelyn made her first trip back to Red Hollow. She'd asked Clay for permission to visit the general store for supplies, and he'd immediately offered to drive her in the wagon. The town was busier than it had been on her arrival, the streets crowded with ranchers and their families doing their weekly shopping. Evelyn felt eyes following her as she walked beside Clay toward Crowell's store, felt the weight of speculation and judgment. Inside the store, Silas was behind the counter. He looked up when the bell chimed, and his expression went cold when he saw who'd entered. "Mr. Maddox," he said stiffly. "Miss Hart." "Silas," Clay said, his tone equally chilly. "We're here to purchase supplies." "I'm surprised you're still patronizing my establishment," Silas said. "I was under the impression you preferred ordering from Denver." "I do, but Miss Hart needed some items that couldn't wait for delivery." Evelyn moved through the store, selecting thread, needles, fabric for new dish towels. She was aware of Silas watching her, his expression a mixture of disdain and something else, perhaps regret, though she doubted he was capable of such an emotion. When she brought her selections to the counter, Prudence appeared from the back room. The older woman's eyes raked over Evelyn with undisguised hostility. "So," Prudence said, "you're working for Mr. Maddox now. How convenient." The implication was clear, and it made Evelyn's cheeks burn. But before she could respond, Clay stepped forward. "Miss Crowell," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "if you're implying something improper about Miss Hart's employment, I suggest you reconsider. She's my housekeeper. Nothing more, nothing less. And she's earned the respect of every man on my ranch through her hard work and skill." "Skill?" Prudence's laugh was sharp. "What skill does a mail-order bride have except—" "She saved one of my men's lives," Clay cut her off, "stitched up a wound that would have crippled him, nursed him through recovery. She's worth 10 of your brother, and I'll thank you to speak of her with the respect she deserves." The store had gone silent. Several customers were watching with undisguised interest. Prudence's face went white, then red. "How dare you speak to me that way? How dare you speak to Miss Hart that way?" Clay countered. "Now ring up her purchases before I take my business elsewhere permanently." Silas quickly tallied the items, his hands shaking slightly. When Evelyn handed him the money, he wouldn't meet her eyes. Outside, Clay loaded the supplies into the wagon with sharp, angry movements. Evelyn climbed onto the seat and waited until he'd settled beside her. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did." Clay gathered the reins but didn't signal the horses to move yet. "They had no right to speak to you that way, no right to imply—" He stopped, his jaw tight. "I appreciate you defending me," Evelyn said, "but by doing so, you've probably made their gossip worse. Now they'll definitely believe there's something improper happening at the Circle M." Clay looked at her, his eyes fierce. "Let them believe what they want. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's what matters." "Is it?" Evelyn asked. "Or will their gossip damage your reputation, make it harder for you to do business?" "My reputation can survive gossip, Evelyn. Can yours survive being insulted by small-minded people who don't know you?" The question hung between them. Evelyn thought about the women in Philadelphia, about the whispers and the judgment, about how she'd let their opinions drive her across the country into a stranger's arms. "I don't care what they think," she said, and realized it was true. "I don't care about Silas or Prudence or anyone else in this town. I care about doing my job well. I care about the respect I've earned from Jake and Tom and the others. That's enough. Clay's expression softened. Good, he said simply. Then he clicked to the horses, and they headed back toward the Circle M. That night, Evelyn lay in her cabin and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. The horses in the corrals, the distant call of an owl, the creek murmuring its endless song. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. More stars than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia, where city lights drowned out all but the brightest. She'd been at the Circle M for almost a month. Her 3-month contract suddenly seemed both impossibly long and frighteningly short. What would happen when it ended? Would she stay? Would Clay ask her to? Did she want him to? Evelyn didn't have answers to any of those questions. But as she drifted toward sleep, she realized that for the first time since her father's death, she wasn't just surviving. She was living, and maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to hope for something more. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late June, when Jake rode back to the ranch house with his face set in grim lines and his jaw tight enough to crack walnuts. Evelyn was in the kitchen rolling out pie dough when she heard the heavy thud of his boots on the porch. Through the window, she could see Clay emerging from the barn, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as Jake dismounted and spoke in low, urgent tones. Their conversation was too quiet for her to hear, but she watched Clay's posture change, his shoulders squaring, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Then both men were striding toward the house, their faces dark as thunderclouds. "How many?" Clay was asking as they pushed through the door. 30 head, maybe more. Took them sometime last night from the eastern pasture." Jake pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Clean work. No mess. No noise. Professional." Clay's curse was low and vicious. He paced to the window and stood staring out at the mountains, his whole body vibrating with barely controlled fury. Evelyn set down her rolling pin, her hands suddenly cold despite the warmth from the stove. "The rustlers?" "Third time in 2 months," Jake said. His weathered face was tight with frustration. "They're getting bolder. This time, they didn't even wait for the new moon. Took them with a half moon bright enough to read by." "Did you find tracks?" Clay asked, still not turning from the window. "Some. Headed northeast toward the canyon country. But they know what they're doing, kept to rocky ground, split up the herd to confuse the trail." Jake's voice was heavy with defeat. "By the time we could organize a posse, they'll be long gone." Clay turned then, and the look on his face made Evelyn's breath catch. She'd seen him angry before, at Silas, at injustice, at incompetence. But this was different. This was the cold, calculated fury of a man who'd been pushed too far and was done tolerating it. "Get the men together," Clay said. "Every hand who can ride. We're going after them." "Clay, I'm done losing cattle to these bastards, Jake. I'm done watching them bleed me dry while the sheriff sits in town with his thumb up his ass." Clay's voice was flat, final. "Get the men. We leave in an hour." Jake nodded and left, his boots heavy on the porch steps. Evelyn watched Clay, saw the way his hands gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles went white. "How much have you lost?" she asked quietly. "Counting today? Nearly 100 head over the past 2 months. That's close to $2,000. Clay's laugh was bitter. "Money I was saving to expand the herd, to build better winter shelters, to—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter what I was saving it for. It's gone." Evelyn dried her hands on her apron and crossed to stand beside him. "You're going after them." "I have to. If I don't, they'll keep coming back until there's nothing left to take. It's dangerous. Everything out here is dangerous." Clay looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his eyes made her chest tight. "I need you to stay close to the house while we're gone. Keep the doors locked. If you see anything unusual, riders, strangers, anything, you get inside and you bar the door. Understand?" "I'm not helpless, Clay. I know you're not. But I also know that rustlers don't always work alone, and I don't know who might be watching the ranch while we're out tracking cattle thieves." His hand came up, hesitated, then settled briefly on her shoulder. "Just promise me you'll be careful." The warmth of his touch burned through the thin cotton of her dress. "I promise. If you promise the same." "Deal," Clay said, and his mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. He left her standing in the kitchen and went to prepare for the hunt. Through the window, Evelyn watched the ranch transform into organized chaos. Men saddled horses, checked rifles, filled canteens. Clay moved among them with quiet authority, his voice too low to hear but his meaning clear from the way the hands nodded and moved to obey. Within the hour, 6 riders left the Circle M headed northeast, following the trail of the stolen cattle. Jake stayed behind to watch the ranch, along with Danny, who was still too young and inexperienced for the dangerous work of tracking armed thieves. The ranch felt emptier without Clay's presence. Evelyn went through her daily tasks with mechanical precision, baking bread, preparing supper, scrubbing the already clean kitchen floor, but her mind kept drifting to the mountains, to the dangerous men Clay was pursuing, to all the things that could go wrong. Evening fell, and still the riders didn't return. Evelyn served supper to Jake and Danny in tense silence, then retreated to her cabin as the last light faded from the sky. She locked the door as Clay had asked, but sleep eluded her. She lay in the darkness listening to every sound, the horses shifting in the corrals, the wind in the pines, the distant howl of a coyote. Somewhere out there, Clay was hunting men who wouldn't hesitate to kill him if cornered. The thought made her stomach twist with fear she hadn't expected to feel. When had she started caring so much? When had Clay Maddox gone from being simply her employer to someone whose safety mattered more than her own? She knew the answer, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. It had been gradual, an accumulation of small moments. The way he'd defended her to Silas and Prudence, the quiet evenings on the porch, talking about nothing and everything. The way he looked at her sometimes, like she was something precious and surprising. The way she'd felt safe in his arms after saving Tom, like she'd finally found a place to set down all the fear and exhaustion she'd been carrying. Evelyn must have dozed eventually because she woke to the sound of hoofbeats thundering into the ranch yard. She scrambled from bed, pulling on her wrapper, and peered through the window. In the pale pre-dawn light, she could see riders dismounting, Clay and his men, back from their hunt. But something was wrong. The way they moved, the slump in their shoulders, told her everything she needed to know before she even left the cabin. By the time Evelyn reached the main house, the men were already gathered in the kitchen. Their faces were haggard, streaked with trail dust, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and defeat. "Lost the trail in the canyon country," Pete was saying as Evelyn slipped into the room. "They had fresh horses waiting, split up 3 different ways. We tried following all the tracks, but they had too much of a head start," Clay finished. He was slumped in a chair at the table, his hat discarded, his dark hair falling across his forehead. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "They knew exactly what they were doing, probably been planning this route for weeks." "At least nobody got hurt," Tom said, trying for optimism and failing. "Nobody got hurt because we never caught up to them," Clay said bitterly. "They're probably in the next territory by now, selling my cattle to some buyer who doesn't ask questions." Evelyn moved to the stove and began making coffee, her hand steady even though her heart was racing. The men needed food, rest, and someone who wasn't drowning in defeat. "When did you last eat?" she asked. "Yesterday morning," Jake said, "before we left." 24 hours without food while riding hard through rough country. Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she didn't scold them. Instead, she pulled out the bread she'd baked the previous day, found bacon and eggs, and began cooking with swift efficiency. The men ate in exhausted silence, shoveling food into their mouths with the mechanical precision of soldiers after a battle. Clay barely touched his plate, just sat staring at the scarred table surface as though seeing something the rest of them couldn't. When the hands had finished and shuffled off to the bunkhouse for much-needed sleep, Evelyn found herself alone in the kitchen with Clay. He hadn't moved from his chair, his untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. "You should eat," Evelyn said gently. "Not hungry." "Clay." "I failed them," he said, his voice raw. "My men, my ranch. I promised I'd protect what was ours, and I couldn't even track down the bastards who stole from us." Evelyn sat down across from him. "You did everything you could." "It wasn't enough." Clay's hands curled into fists on the table. "I keep losing ground, Evelyn. The rustlers, Silas squeezing every rancher with his inflated prices, drought threatening the summer grass. Sometimes I wonder if I'm fighting a losing battle. You're tired, Evelyn said. You've been riding for 24 hours without rest. Things always look worse when you're exhausted. Do they? Clay looked at her then, and the defeat in his eyes cut her to the bone. Or do they just look clearer? Before Evelyn could respond, the kitchen door burst open and Danny stumbled in, his young face white with panic. Boss, Jake says you need to come quick. Someone's approaching the ranch. Single rider coming fast. The exhaustion fell away from Clay like a discarded coat. He was on his feet and moving before Danny finished speaking, Evelyn right behind him. They emerged onto the porch to find Jake standing in the yard with his rifle in hand, watching a rider gallop toward them across the eastern pasture. As the rider drew closer, Evelyn could see it was a boy, no more than 12 or 13, mounted on a lathered horse that looked ready to collapse. "Help!" the boy was shouting. "Please, somebody help!" Clay vaulted off the porch and caught the horse's bridle as the boy pulled up in a spray of dirt. "Easy, son, what's wrong?" "It's my paw," the boy gasped, tears streaming down his dust-caked face. "He's hurt bad. We were checking fence line and he fell, broke his leg, something awful. Ma sent me to fetch the doctor, but the doc's gone to Denver and won't be back for 3 days. Mr. Henderson at the station said you might have someone who could help. Said there was a lady here who doctored Tom Garrett when he got hurt." Every eye turned to Evelyn. "Where's your pa?" she asked, already moving toward the barn. "Johnson Ranch, about 8 miles southeast." "Please, ma'am, he's in terrible pain and the bone's sticking out all wrong." Evelyn's stomach clenched, but her voice remained steady. "Danny, saddle me a horse. The gentlest one you have. Clay, I need supplies, clean cloth, whiskey, anything that can be used for splinting." "Evelyn, you can't," Clay started. "Can't what? Help a man who's injured?" She turned to face him, her chin lifted. "I told you I've done this before. Maybe not a broken leg, but I've read enough medical texts to know the principles. If that bone isn't set properly, he could lose the leg, or worse." "I'll come with you," Clay said. "You've been riding for 24 hours. You can barely stand." "Then I'll sit in the saddle, but I'm not letting you ride 8 miles alone to treat a compound fracture." They stared at each other for a long moment, a battle of wills that neither wanted to lose. Finally, Jake cleared his throat. "Both of you go," he said. "Clay can make sure Miss Hart gets there safe, and Miss Hart can do the doctoring. Tom and Pete can handle things here. We'll be fine for a few hours." It was the only solution that made sense, and they both knew it. Within 15 minutes, Evelyn was mounted on a steady mare named Bess, her supplies packed in saddlebags, with Clay beside her on his own horse despite his exhaustion. The young boy, he said his name was Billy Johnson, led them southeast at a pace that was just short of reckless. Evelyn clung to the saddle and tried not to think about what she'd find when they arrived. A compound fracture meant the bone had broken through the skin. That meant risk of infection, catastrophic blood loss, possible amputation if things went wrong. She'd read about setting bones in her medical texts, had studied the diagrams and memorized the procedures, but reading and doing were vastly different things. The Johnson Ranch was smaller than the Circle M, more of a homestead than a working cattle operation. They found Mr. Johnson lying in the yard where he'd fallen, his wife kneeling beside him with her apron pressed to his leg. Blood had soaked through the fabric, dark and spreading. Evelyn dismounted before her horse had fully stopped and ran to them. One look at the injury confirmed her worst fears. The bone of the lower leg had snapped and torn through the skin just below the knee. It was a clean break at least, not shattered, but the leg was twisted at an unnatural angle and Mr. Johnson's face was gray with shock. "Ma'am, can you help him?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice breaking. "Can you help my husband?" Evelyn met the woman's desperate eyes and made a decision. "Yes," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "But I'm going to need your help, and this is going to be difficult for all of us." She turned to find Clay standing behind her, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this new crisis. "I need you to hold him down," Evelyn said quietly. "When I set the bone, he's going to fight. He won't be able to help it. The pain will be too much. Can you do that?" Clay's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Tell me what to do." Evelyn organized her supplies with shaking hands, drawing on every scrap of knowledge she'd accumulated from her medical texts and her own desperate experiences. She cleaned the wound as best she could with whiskey and boiled water that Mrs. Johnson brought from the house. She cut away the torn trouser leg and examined the break from every angle. The bone needed to be pulled back into place, the leg straightened, then splinted to keep it immobile while it healed. Simple in theory, agonizing in practice. "Mr. Johnson," Evelyn said, leaning over so he could see her face, "I'm going to set your leg now. I won't lie to you. This is going to hurt worse than anything you've ever felt. But if I don't do it, you'll lose the leg. Do you understand?" Johnson's teeth were chattering, but he managed a nod. "Do it." Clay positioned himself at Johnson's shoulders, his weight ready to hold the man down. Mrs. Johnson took her husband's hand, her face pale but determined. Billy stood nearby, tears streaming down his face. Evelyn took a breath, said a prayer to whatever force might be listening, and grasped the injured leg with both hands. "Now," she said, and pulled. Johnson's scream split the morning air. He thrashed violently, but Clay held him firm, muscles straining with the effort. Evelyn felt the bone shift beneath her hands, felt it slide back into position with a sensation that made her stomach turn. But she didn't stop, didn't hesitate. She straightened the leg, feeling for proper alignment, checking that the bone was seated correctly. Then, moving quickly before she could lose her nerve, she packed the wound with clean cloth and began splinting the leg using boards she'd found in the barn. She worked with methodical precision, binding the splints tight enough to immobilize the leg, but not so tight that they'd cut off circulation. By the time she finished, Johnson had mercifully passed out, and her own hands were trembling so badly she could barely tie off the final bandage. "It's done," she said hoarsely. "The bone is set. Now we have to hope infection doesn't set in." Mrs. Johnson was crying, her relief palpable. "Thank you. Oh, thank you. If you hadn't come—" "He'll need to stay completely still for at least 6 weeks," Evelyn interrupted, her voice flat with exhaustion. "No weight on that leg, no movement if you can help it. Change the bandages daily, watch for signs of infection, fever, red streaks from the wound, foul smell. If you see any of that, send for me immediately." "We will. We will," Mrs. Johnson clutched Evelyn's bloody hands. "How can we ever repay you?" "There's no payment necessary," Evelyn said. "Just take care of him." They helped move Johnson into the house and settled him in bed. Evelyn left detailed instructions for his care, her medical knowledge flowing in a steady stream now that the crisis had passed. Then she and Clay rode back toward the Circle M in the late afternoon heat, both of them silent with exhaustion. Halfway back, Evelyn's hand started shaking again. She tried to hide it, but Clay noticed. He always noticed. "Pull up," he said quietly. "I'm fine." "Pull up, Evelyn." She obeyed, and Clay dismounted, then helped her down from her horse. The moment her feet touched the ground, her legs gave out. Clay caught her, holding her upright with steady strength. "You did it again," he said, his voice rough with something she couldn't name. "Saved another life." "I was terrified," Evelyn whispered. "The whole time I was terrified I'd make it worse." "But you didn't. You set that bone like you'd done it 100 times. Clay's arms tightened around her. "Where did you get this courage, Evelyn Hart?" "I don't know. When someone needs help, I can't walk away." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, holding each other up, both of them covered in dust and blood and sweat. It should have been improper. It should have been scandalous. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When they finally made it back to the Circle M, word of what Evelyn had done had already spread. Jake met them in the yard, his weathered face creased with concern. "Billy Johnson stopped here on his way back home," he said. "Told us what you did, Miss Hart. Setting a compound fracture in a ranch yard with no proper tools. That's—" He shook his head, at a loss for words. "That's something." Over the following days, as June gave way to July, the Circle M settled back into its rhythms. Mr. Johnson's leg healed without infection, and word of Evelyn's skill spread through the valley like wildfire. She found herself treating minor injuries for neighboring ranchers, a burned hand here, a gashed arm there, a child's fever that wouldn't break. Clay watched her with something in his eyes that made Evelyn's breath catch. He'd started finding excuses to be near her, helping her reorganize the medicine supplies she'd accumulated, riding with her when she made house calls, sitting at the kitchen table while she prepared remedies from herbs she'd begun growing in a small garden behind her cabin. They were dancing around something neither of them was ready to name, but it was there, growing stronger with each passing day, each shared glance, each moment when their hands brushed and neither pulled away. Then, on a Friday night in mid-July, everything changed. Evelyn woke to the sound of gunfire. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering, as three sharp cracks split the darkness. Shouts followed, men's voices, angry and afraid. Through her window she could see the orange glow of fire. The barn was burning. Evelyn grabbed her wrapper and ran barefoot across the yard. Men were everywhere, the ranch hands rushing from the bunkhouse, Jake shouting orders, Clay running toward the barn with a bucket. But even as they organized to fight the fire, more shots rang out from the darkness beyond the corrals. "Get down!" Clay roared, and Evelyn dropped to her knees in the dirt as a bullet whined past her head. This wasn't an accident. This was an attack. Jake appeared at her side, his face grim in the firelight. "Get to the house, Miss Hart. Bar the doors, and don't come out for anyone but me or the boss." "But now!" Evelyn ran for the main house, her wrapper billowing behind her. She made it through the door and slammed it shut, throwing the heavy bar into place. Through the windows, she could see the battle unfolding in the yard. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames leaping into the night sky. The ranch hands were fighting the fire while simultaneously trying to protect themselves from whoever was shooting from the darkness. Clay was in the thick of it, shouting orders, directing the bucket brigade, his rifle in hand. As Evelyn watched, he fired 3 shots toward the tree line, and she heard a man's cry of pain. The rustlers. It had to be. They'd come back, and this time they weren't just stealing cattle. They were trying to burn the Circle M to the ground. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists. She thought about the rifle she'd seen in Clay's study, about the bullets in the drawer. She thought about standing here uselessly while the men risked their lives to protect the ranch. Then she thought about Philadelphia, about being helpless, about letting things happen to her instead of taking control. She moved to the study, found the rifle, checked that it was loaded. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but she'd watched the men practice, had seen how they held the weapons, how they aimed. How hard could it be? Evelyn returned to the front window, opened it just enough to rest the rifle barrel on the sill, and waited. In the firelight, she could see shadows moving at the edge of the tree line, men on horseback, circling like wolves. One of them broke from cover, riding hard toward the barn with what looked like another torch in his hand. Evelyn tracked him with the rifle, her breath steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her backwards, and the shot went wide. But it was close enough that the rider's horse reared and bolted, throwing its rider. The man scrambled to his feet and ran back toward the trees, abandoning his torch. Clay's head whipped around, searching for the source of the shot. When he saw Evelyn in the window with the rifle, his face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, fear, anger, and something that might have been pride. "Get away from that window!" he roared. Evelyn ignored him. She reloaded and waited for another target. The attack lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. The rustlers, or whoever they were, seemed more interested in causing chaos than in actually killing anyone. When they realized the defenders were armed and fighting back, they melted back into the darkness and disappeared. The barn was a total loss, reduced to a skeleton of charred timbers and smoking ash. But the house and bunkhouse were intact, the livestock were safe, and miraculously, no one was seriously injured. As dawn broke gray and smoky over the Circle M, Clay climbed the porch steps and pushed through the front door. His face was black with soot, his eyes red from smoke, and his expression was thunderous. "What," he said with dangerous quiet, "did you think you were doing with that rifle?" Evelyn set the weapon down carefully and met his gaze. "I was protecting my home." "You're—" Clay stopped, his jaw working. "You could have been killed. So could you, so could Jake or Tom or any of the others. At least I was behind cover. You don't know how to shoot." "I learned." Evelyn gestured to the window. "I hit what I was aiming at, didn't I?" "You got lucky." "No." Evelyn stepped closer to him, close enough to see the fear beneath his anger. "I made a choice. To stand and fight instead of hiding. To protect what matters instead of letting someone else do all the work." Her voice softened. "You've taught me that, Clay. You and this ranch, and these men who've treated me like I belong here. I wasn't going to cower inside while all of you risked everything. Clay stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he started to laugh, a rough, exhausted sound that was edged with something dangerously close to hysteria. "You're going to be the death of me, Evelyn Hart," he said. Then his hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing soot from her cheeks. "You're the bravest, most stubborn, most amazing woman I've ever met." Evelyn's breath caught. "Clay, I love you," he said, the words rough but certain. "I didn't mean to, didn't plan to. But somewhere between watching you save Tom's life and seeing you face down Silas's sister and finding you at my window with a rifle you barely know how to shoot, I fell in love with you." The world seemed to stop. In the distance, Evelyn could hear the men talking, could smell the acrid smoke from the ruined barn. But all of that faded into insignificance compared to the look in Clay's eyes. "I'm your employee," she whispered. "To hell with the contract. To hell with what's proper or sensible or any of it." Clay's forehead rested against hers. "I want you here, Evelyn. Not as my housekeeper, as my partner, my wife. The woman who stands beside me and refuses to back down even when any sane person would run." "Clay, Evelyn's voice broke. "I'm afraid." "So am I. Loving someone means giving them the power to destroy you. I learned that when I lost Sarah." His hands tightened on her face. "But I'd rather have one day loving you than a lifetime playing it safe." Evelyn looked at this man who'd saved her from humiliation, who'd given her work and dignity and a place to belong. This rough-edged rancher who read poetry at night and fought for what was his and looked at her like she was something precious and rare. "I love you too," she said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. "I think I have for weeks. I was just too scared to admit it." Clay kissed her then, and it tasted like smoke and sweat and promise. It was nothing like the chaste kisses Evelyn had imagined sharing with Silas, nothing like the careful romance of Philadelphia courtships. It was real and raw and absolutely right. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was rising over the mountains, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of gold and pink. The Circle M was damaged but not broken. The rustlers would probably come again. There would be more fights, more struggles, more moments of fear and uncertainty. But as Evelyn stood in Clay's arms and watched the new day dawn, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was worth everything. The kiss still burned on Evelyn's lips when reality crashed back in with the sound of Jake's boots on the porch steps. Clay pulled back, his hands lingering on her face for one more heartbeat before he stepped away, putting a respectable distance between them just as the foreman pushed through the door. Jake's weathered face was grim, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke. "We got tracks, boss. 4 riders, maybe 5, headed west toward Blackwater Canyon. They left in a hurry after Miss Hart took that shot." Clay's expression shifted instantly from tender to tactical. "How long ago?" "Maybe 20 minutes, but they got a good lead on us." Jake paused, his gaze flicking between Clay and Evelyn with barely concealed curiosity. "Tom and Pete are ready to ride if you want to go after them. Danny's watching the horses." "No." Clay's voice was flat, final. "We're not riding into an ambush in unfamiliar territory with exhausted men and horses. That's exactly what they'd want." "But boss, if we let them get away, they'll come back, I know that." Clay moved to the window, staring out at the smoking ruins of his barn. "But I'm done playing their game, Jake. It's time we change the rules." Evelyn watched him, saw the way his shoulders were set, the hard line of his jaw. This was the Clay Maddox the valley whispered about, the man who'd built a failing ranch into something formidable through sheer determination and strategic brilliance. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked. "I want to know who's behind this. The rustling, the attack, all of it." Clay turned back to face them. "This isn't just random theft anymore. This is personal. Someone wants to drive me out of business, burn me down to nothing. I need to know who and why." "You think it's Crowell?" Jake's voice was carefully neutral. The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Evelyn's stomach clenched as she thought about Silas's cold eyes, Prudence's barely concealed malice, the way they'd looked at her with such contempt in the store. "I think Silas has the most to gain if the independent ranchers fail," Clay said slowly. "With us gone, everyone would be forced to buy from him at whatever prices he sets. But I can't prove it. Not yet. Then what's the plan? Clay's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. We rebuild. We fortify. We show them that burning one barn won't break us, and we wait for them to make a mistake. Jake nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. A trap. Exactly. But first, Clay's gaze moved to Evelyn, softening at the edges. First, Miss Hart and I need to have a conversation with the sheriff. I want this attack on record, official. I want witnesses to the fact that someone tried to burn us out. Sheriff Dalton's useless, Jake said bluntly. He won't do anything to upset Crowell. Maybe not, but he'll have to acknowledge the complaint. And when we finally have proof of who's behind this, I want a paper trail showing that I tried to handle it legally first. Clay's voice hardened. Cover my back for what comes after. An hour later, Evelyn found herself in a wagon beside Clay, heading back toward Red Hollow. She'd changed into a clean dress, scrubbed the soot from her face and hands, and twisted her hair into a neat knot. But she could still feel the rifle's recoil in her shoulder, could still taste smoke and fear and Clay's kiss. The morning was bright and clear, a cruel contrast to the destruction they'd left behind. Clay drove in silence, his hands steady on the reins, his face set in hard lines. Finally, Evelyn couldn't stand the quiet anymore. What happens now? She asked. Between us? Clay glanced at her, and some of the hardness softened. What do you want to happen? I don't know. Evelyn twisted her hands in her lap. This morning you said you wanted to marry me, but we've only known each other for 2 months, Clay. People will talk. People are already talking. They have been since the day I brought you to the ranch. His voice was gentle. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Evelyn. I'm just asking if you'll consider a future with me. A real future, not just a 3-month contract. Evelyn's heart was racing. I came west to marry a man I'd never met, based on nothing but letters and desperation. That ended in humiliation. How is this different? Because you know me now, Clay said simply. You've seen me at my worst, exhausted, defeated, covered in other men's blood and barn smoke. You've seen how I run my ranch, how I treat my men, how I handle trouble. You know exactly what you'd be getting into. Do I? Evelyn turned to face him. Because from where I'm sitting, I see a man who's being targeted by dangerous people, a man whose barn just burned down, a man who might lose everything he's built. That's fair? Clay pulled the wagon to a stop on the side of the road, setting the brake before turning to her. So let me be clear about what I'm offering. I'm offering you a life that won't be easy or safe or predictable. I'm offering you a partnership where I'll ask for your counsel and actually listen to it. I'm offering you a home that you'll help build, decisions you'll help make, a future that's ours together, not mine with you as decoration. He paused. And I'm offering you all the time you need to decide if that's what you want. Evelyn stared at him, this rough-edged man who'd somehow learned to see her as an equal, who valued her strength instead of being threatened by it. What if I say no? Then I honor the contract we signed. In another 5 weeks, you'll have saved enough to go to Denver or San Francisco or anywhere else you choose. I'll give you references that will help you find work, and I'll let you go, even though it'll tear my heart out. Clay's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. But I'm hoping you won't say no. I'm not saying no, Evelyn said quietly. I'm just saying I need time to be sure, to not make another desperate decision that I'll regret. That's all I'm asking for, time and honesty. Clay picked up the reins again. Now let's go talk to a useless sheriff so I can at least say I tried the legal route before I handle this my own way. Red Hollow was bustling with Saturday morning activity when they arrived. Farmers and ranchers crowded the streets, women in their market day dresses moved between shops, and children ran wild between the wagons. Evelyn could feel eyes following them as Clay helped her down from the wagon, could practically hear the whispers starting. The sheriff's office was a small building next to the jail, with a faded sign and bars on the windows. Sheriff Marcus Dalton was a soft man in his 50s, with a paunch that suggested too many free meals and a handshake agreement with Silas Crowell that everyone knew about but couldn't prove. He looked up from his desk when Clay and Evelyn entered, his expression shifting from bored to wary. Maddox, he said, not rising from his chair. What brings you to town? Someone burned my barn down last night, Clay said flatly. Shot at my men, tried to burn the whole ranch. Dalton's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation. You got proof? I've got a burned barn, bullet holes in my bunkhouse, and 5 witnesses who'll swear to what happened. Witnesses who work for you, Dalton pointed out. Might be biased, don't you think? Clay's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice remained level. I'm here to file an official complaint, Sheriff. Whether you investigate it or not is up to you, but I want it on record that I reported the attack. And what do you expect me to do about it? Ride out to every ranch in the valley asking if they happened to burn down Clay Maddox's barn? Dalton leaned back in his chair. I got limited resources, Maddox. Can't go chasing shadows. Even when those shadows are shooting at citizens? Evelyn spoke up, her voice sharp. What about protecting the people in this valley? Dalton's gaze slid to her, and something unpleasant flickered in his eyes. Miss Hart, isn't it? Heard you're working for Maddox now. Heard a lot of things about that arrangement, actually. The implication was clear and disgusting. Before Evelyn could respond, Clay moved, not violently, but with controlled purpose. He placed both hands on Dalton's desk and leaned forward until they were nearly nose to nose. You can refuse to investigate, Clay said, his voice deadly quiet. You can sit in this office and do nothing while people try to burn me out. But you will speak to Miss Hart with respect, or you and I are going to have a different kind of conversation. Are we clear? Dalton's face went red, then pale. That sounds like a threat, Maddox. It's a promise. File my complaint or don't. But choose your next words carefully. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Then Dalton reached for a piece of paper with shaking hands. I'll file the complaint, he muttered. But don't expect miracles. Probably just drifters passing through. Long gone by now. Of course, Clay said, straightening. Because that's the easy answer, isn't it? Blame it on drifters and do nothing. They left the sheriff's office with a receipt for the complaint and nothing else. Outside, Evelyn could see the tension in Clay's shoulders, the way his jaw was locked tight. That was pointless, she said. No, it was necessary. Now when I handle this myself, no one can say I didn't try legal channels first. Clay helped her back into the wagon. There's one more stop I need to make. You can wait here if you'd rather not be part of it. Where are you going? Crowell's store. Evelyn's stomach clenched, but she lifted her chin. I'm coming with you. The Crowell General Store was crowded with Saturday shoppers when they entered. Conversations died as people noticed Clay and Evelyn, replaced by whispers that followed them through the aisles like a cold wind. Silas was behind the counter, and Prudence was restocking shelves near the back. Silas's face went carefully blank when he saw them. Maddox, Miss Hart, what can I do for you? You can tell me where you were last night, Clay said, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent store. I was here, in my home behind the store. Same as every night. Silas's eyes narrowed. Why? Someone burned my barn down, shot at my men, tried to destroy my ranch. Clay's voice was conversational, but his eyes were ice cold. Funny timing, don't you think? Just days after you and I had that conversation about ordering supplies from Denver instead of paying your inflated prices. The store had gone completely silent now. Every customer, every clerk was watching with undisguised fascination. Are you accusing me of something, Maddox? Silas's voice rose. Because if you are, you'd better have proof. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just making sure everyone knows what happened. That someone is trying to drive me out of business through violence. Clay's gaze swept the store, making eye contact with the watching crowd. And I'm making it clear that I won't be intimidated. Not by rustlers, not by arson, not by anything. The Circle M isn't going anywhere. Is that a threat? Prudence's voice cut across the room like a knife. Clay turned to look at her, his expression hard. It's a statement of fact, Miss Crowell. Nothing more, nothing less. You come in here disrupting honest business, making wild accusations. I haven't accused anyone of anything, Clay interrupted. I've simply stated what happened to my property. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should ask yourself why. The siblings exchanged a look, quick, furtive, that told Evelyn more than words ever could. They knew something. Maybe not the details, maybe not the names of the men who'd attacked the ranch, but they knew something. Clay saw it too. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might press further. Then he seemed to make a decision. "Come on, Evelyn," he said, offering his arm. "We're done here." As they turned to leave, Silas called out, "You're making a mistake, Maddox. Fighting battles you can't win." Clay paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. "I've won every battle I've fought so far, Crowell. I don't plan to stop now." The ride back to the Circle M was tense and silent. Clay's hands were white-knuckled on the reins, his jaw so tight Evelyn worried he might crack a tooth. She wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, as the ranch came into view, Clay spoke. "I shouldn't have taken you in there. That was stupid and reckless." "I chose to go," Evelyn said. "You didn't force me." "Still, if Crowell is behind this, and I think he is, I just painted a bigger target on both our backs." "We were already targets," Evelyn's voice was calm. "From the moment you defended me in that store 2 months ago, from the moment I chose to stay at the Circle M instead of slinking back east. We've been targets all along, Clay. At least now we're facing it head on." Clay pulled the wagon to a stop in the ranch yard and turned to look at her. "How are you so brave?" "I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid." Evelyn met his eyes. "And I'm tired of letting small, cruel people dictate my life. Silas already tried to break me once. I won't let him do it again." Something fierce and proud blazed in Clay's expression. Then he was leaning across the wagon seat, his hand cupping her face, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was part desperation and part promise. Evelyn kissed him back, not caring that they were in full view of anyone who might be watching, not caring about propriety or scandal or any of it. When they finally pulled apart, Jake was standing on the porch of the main house, trying very hard not to smile. "Hate to interrupt," the foreman called, "but we got company. The Johnsons are here, along with the Petersons and the Weavers. They heard about the fire." Over the next few hours, the Circle M became something Evelyn had never seen before, a community rallying around one of its own. Neighboring ranchers arrived with their families, bringing supplies, lumber, offers of help, misses. Johnson brought food enough to feed an army and insisted on hugging Evelyn until she could barely breathe. "You saved my husband's leg," the woman said fiercely. "We'll help you rebuild 10 barns if that's what it takes." By sunset, plans had been drawn up for a new barn, bigger and better than the old one. Men volunteered labor, materials, expertise. The valley's smaller ranchers, the ones who'd been squeezed by Silas's monopoly and threatened by the rustlers, saw what had happened to the Circle M and recognized it for what it was, a warning shot. If Clay Maddox could be targeted like this, none of them were safe. That night, after the neighbors had gone home and the ranch had settled into exhausted quiet, Evelyn found Clay sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the stars. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "They're with you," she said quietly. "The other ranchers. They see what's happening." "I know, but I'm worried about what comes next." Clay's voice was heavy. "If Crowell is behind this, he won't stop just because I filed a complaint and made some accusations. He'll escalate, and people could get hurt. Then we'll be ready." Clay looked at her. "When did you start saying we?" Evelyn considered the question. "I think it was somewhere between Tom's injury and tonight's kiss. Maybe earlier. Maybe the moment you offered me work when I had nothing." She paused. "I know I said I needed time to decide about a future with you, but the truth is, I think I decided weeks ago. I was just too scared to admit it. And now? Now I'm still scared, but I'm more scared of walking away from something real because I'm afraid of getting hurt." Evelyn took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "My contract ends in 5 weeks. I don't want to leave when it's up." Clay's grip tightened on her hand. "Are you saying I say?" "I'm saying yes. To courting, to partnership, to whatever future we can build together." As Evelyn's voice was steady, despite the racing of her heart, "I'm saying I love you, Clay Maddox, and I choose this. I choose you. I choose us." For a moment, Clay didn't move, didn't speak. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried in her hair. "I'll do right by you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I swear it, Evelyn. I'll court you proper, give you time to be absolutely sure, and when you're ready, Only when you're ready. I'll marry you in front of the whole valley, make you my wife in every way that matters." "I'm already sure," Evelyn said against his chest, "but I appreciate the gesture." Clay's laugh was shaky. "Still, I want to do this right. My mother raised me to be a gentleman, remember?" "Your mother raised you to be a good man," Evelyn corrected. "There's a difference." They sat on the porch steps until the stars wheeled overhead and the night air grew cold. Inside the house, Jake had left a lamp burning in the kitchen, a subtle reminder that while the world might be changing, some proprieties still mattered. Eventually, Clay walked Evelyn to her cabin, his hand warm in hers. At her door, he kissed her goodnight, a soft, sweet kiss that promised patience and devotion and all the time in the world. "Sleep well," he said. "Tomorrow, we start rebuilding." Over the following weeks, the new barn rose from the ashes of the old one. Neighbors came to help frame the walls, raise the roof, install the doors. It was larger than before, built with an eye toward defense as well as function. Wide doors that could be barred from inside, high windows that offered views of the approaches, a loft that could serve as a watchtower if necessary. Clay courted Evelyn with a patience that surprised them both. He brought her wildflowers picked from the high meadows. He taught her to ride better, taking her on long evening rides through the valley. He sat with her in the kitchen while she worked, reading poetry aloud in his rough voice, making her laugh with his terrible dramatic interpretations. The ranch hands watched this courtship with approving smiles and knowing glances. Jake became fiercely protective of Evelyn's reputation, ensuring that she and Clay were never alone in the house without a chaperone, usually himself, pointedly reading a newspaper in the next room, while making enough noise to remind them he was there. But the shadow of the attack never fully lifted. Clay doubled the night watch, keeping men posted at all hours. He organized the neighboring ranchers into an informal alliance, setting up a system of warning fires that could be lit if anyone spotted trouble. The valley prepared for war, even as they hoped for peace. Then, 6 weeks after the barn fire, Sheriff Dalton rode out to the Circle M with news that changed everything. Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the commotion in the yard. She went to the window and saw Dalton dismounting, his face grave. Clay emerged from the barn, and the two men spoke in low tones before heading toward the house. "Miss Hart," Dalton said when he entered the kitchen, removing his hat, "I need to speak with you and Maddox. It's important." They settled at the kitchen table, and Dalton pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I've been doing some investigating, quiet-like so word wouldn't get around, and I found something interesting." He spread the papers across the table. "Land deeds, filed over the past 6 months. Someone's been buying up property around Red Hollow. Small parcels, failed homesteads, land from ranchers who couldn't make it." Clay leaned forward, studying the documents. "Who's buying?" "That's the interesting part. It's all through shell companies, false names. But I did some digging, called in some favors with the land office in Denver." Dalton pulled out one more document, traced it all back to one source, Silas Crowell. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. "Why?" Evelyn asked. "What does he want with all that land?" "Railroad's planning a new line through the valley," Dalton said heavily. "Heard it from a surveyor who came through last month. The route hasn't been announced yet, but Crowell must have inside information. He's been buying up all the land along the planned route. When the railroad comes, that land will be worth 10 times what he paid for it." Clay's face had gone very still. "And the ranchers who won't sell? The ones like me who own land he needs?" "He drives you out," Dalton said simply. "Rustling, fires, attacks. Make it too expensive, too dangerous to stay. Eventually you sell for whatever you can get, and he swoops in with a lowball offer." "You have proof of this?" Clay's voice was deadly calm. "Enough to make a case? The land purchases, the timing, the pattern of attacks. And I've got something else." Dalton pulled out a final document. 3 nights ago, I arrested a man for drunk and disorderly. While he was in my jail, he started talking, bragging, really, about easy money he'd made running cattle and burning barns. I got names, dates, payments, and I got the name of who hired him. "Crowell," Clay said. "His foreman, actually. Man named Virgil Stone. But Stone doesn't act without Crowell's say-so. Everyone knows that." Dalton met Clay's eyes. "I'm going to arrest them both, Crowell for conspiracy, Stone for orchestrating the attacks. But I wanted you to know first. You've got a right to see justice done. Evelyn watched emotions play across Clay's face. Satisfaction, vindication, and underneath it all, a weariness that spoke of battles fought and won at great cost. When? Clay asked. Tomorrow morning. I've got deputies coming from Denver to help. We're doing this by the book, legal and proper. Dalton stood, gathering his papers. I wanted to apologize, Maddox, for not acting sooner, for being in Crowell's pocket. But seeing what he did to you, what he was willing to do for money, he shook his head. That's not the law I swore to uphold. Better late than never, I suppose, Clay said, rising to shake the sheriff's hand. Thank you, Marcus. This means a lot. After Dalton left, Clay stood at the window, his back to Evelyn, his shoulders tight with tension. She came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. It's over, she said quietly. You won. Did I? Clay's voice was hollow. My barn's gone. I lost 100 head of cattle. I spent the last 2 months looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack. That's not winning, Evelyn. That's just surviving. Sometimes surviving is winning, Evelyn said. Sometimes just refusing to give up when everything's trying to break you is the greatest victory of all. Clay turned to her then, and the vulnerability in his eyes made her heart ache. I'm tired, he said simply. Tired of fighting, tired of always being on guard. I just want to build something without constantly defending it. Then that's what we'll do, Evelyn said. Once this is done, once Crowell's in jail and the valley is safe, we'll build a life, a future, a home. Together. Together, Clay echoed, and pulled her into his arms. The next morning, word spread through the valley like wildfire. Sheriff Dalton, backed by deputies from Denver, arrested Silas Crowell and Virgil Stone on charges of conspiracy to commit arson, cattle theft, and attempted murder. The trial was set for 3 weeks later in the county seat. Red Hollow erupted into chaos. Some people, those who'd benefited from Silas's monopoly or feared his influence, protested the arrest loudly. But more people, the ranchers and farmers and ordinary folk who'd been squeezed and exploited for years, celebrated with poorly concealed relief. Prudence Crowell closed the store and hired lawyers from Denver, expensive men in tailored suits who promised to destroy Clay's reputation and prove the whole thing was a vindictive scheme. But the evidence was damning, and when the trial finally came, the jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Silas Crowell was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Virgil Stone got 12. Clay attended the trial every day, sitting in the gallery with Evelyn beside him. When the verdict was read, he showed no satisfaction, no triumph, just a quiet relief that the threat was finally, truly over. On the ride back to the Circle M after the sentencing, Clay was quiet. Evelyn watched him from the corner of her eye, seeing the exhaustion etched into his face, the weight he'd been carrying finally lifting. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Clay was silent for a long moment. Then, "I'm thinking about the future, about the barn we built together, and the ranch we've defended together, and the life we could have together." He looked at her and his eyes were clear and certain. "Your contract ended 2 weeks ago, Evelyn. You're still here. Where else would I be? I don't know, Denver maybe, San Francisco? Somewhere you could be a real doctor instead of a rancher's wife." Evelyn's heart skipped. "Is that a proposal, Clay Maddox?" "Not yet. Not until I can do it properly." Clay pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. "But I want you to know, when I do ask, it won't be because I need a housekeeper or because it's convenient. It'll be because I can't imagine my life without you in it, because you've become the best part of every day, because loving you has made me better than I ever thought I could be." Tears pricked at Evelyn's eyes. "You're making it very hard to wait for that proper proposal." "Good," Clay said, and kissed her in the middle of the road with the mountains watching and the whole sky spreading above them like a blessing. When they finally made it back to the ranch, Jake was waiting on the porch with a smile that suggested he knew exactly what had delayed them. "Welcome home," he said, and the word home had never sounded sweeter. Summer deepened into August, and the Circle M flourished in ways that had nothing to do with cattle or crops. The new barn stood proud against the mountain backdrop, its fresh timber golden in the sunlight. The ranch hands worked with renewed energy, no longer watching the horizon for threats, but instead focused on building something that would last. And Clay courted Evelyn with a patience and thoroughness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. He took her on picnics to high meadows, where wildflowers painted the grass in brilliant colors. He taught her the names of the peaks that ringed the valley, showed her where eagles nested in the cliffs, pointed out the best fishing holes along the creek. They rode together in the cool mornings and sat together on the porch in the warm evenings, and slowly Evelyn learned every facet of the man she'd fallen in love with. She learned that he was stubborn to a fault, but willing to admit when he was wrong, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh at unexpected moments, that he was deeply loyal to the people he cared about and unforgiving toward those who betrayed that loyalty, that he read poetry not because he thought he should, but because the words moved him in ways he couldn't quite explain. And Clay learned Evelyn in return. Discovered that beneath her quiet composure was a will of iron and a mind that could dissect problems with surgical precision. That she had opinions on everything from politics to horse breeding and wasn't afraid to voice them. That she hummed while she worked and talked to the chickens she'd started raising behind her cabin. That she woke before dawn not because she had to, but because she loved watching the sun rise over the mountains. They were learning to be partners, and it was harder and better than either of them had imagined. One evening in late August, as Evelyn was finishing the dinner dishes, Clay appeared in the kitchen doorway with a peculiar expression on his face, nervous and excited and determined all at once. "Walk with me?" he asked. Evelyn dried her hands and followed him outside. Instead of heading toward the porch or the barn, Clay led her to the horses. Within minutes, they were mounted and riding north, away from the ranch buildings, up into the foothills as the sun painted the western sky in shades of crimson and gold. They rode in silence for nearly 30 minutes, climbing steadily, until Clay pulled his horse to a stop on a high overlook Evelyn had never seen before. Below them, the valley spread out like a living map. The Circle M Ranch tucked into its protective hollow, the silver thread of the creek winding through green pastures, the dark line of forest marching up the mountain slopes, and beyond it all, the town of Red Hollow, small and distant. "This is my favorite place in the world," Clay said, dismounting and helping Evelyn down. "I used to come here when I needed to think, after my father died, after Sarah." He paused. "After you arrived and I didn't know what to do with these feelings I was developing for my own housekeeper." Evelyn's breath caught. "Clay—" "Wait, let me say this." He took both her hands in his, and she could feel them trembling slightly. "I brought you here because I wanted you to see something." He turned her gently, pointing to a spot on the valley floor about half a mile north of the main ranch buildings. At first, Evelyn couldn't see what he was indicating. Then she noticed the clearing, the fresh-turned earth, the foundation stones laid out in a careful rectangle. "What is that?" she asked. "That's where I'm building our house," Clay said quietly. "If you'll have me. If you'll marry me and make a life with me." Evelyn's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. She turned to face him and found him already kneeling, one knee on the rocky ground, a small velvet box in his hands. "Evelyn Hart," Clay said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know this isn't Philadelphia, and I'm not some refined gentleman who can give you the life you were raised for. I'm just a rancher who works too hard and reads poetry badly and doesn't always know the right thing to say. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You're brave and brilliant, and you make me want to be better than I am. And if you'll take a chance on me, I swear I'll spend every day of my life making sure you never regret it." He opened the box, and inside was a ring, a simple gold band set with a single sapphire that caught the dying light and threw it back in shades of deep blue. "This was my mother's ring," Clay said. "My father gave it to her when they married. She wore it for 40 years. Through drought and hardship and loss. And she told me before she died that I should give it to a woman who had her strength, a woman who could weather any storm and come out stronger." His eyes met Evelyn's. "That's you, Evelyn. You're the strongest person I've ever known. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Evelyn's face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Clay Maddox, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. I'll weather every storm with you. Yes." Clay's face transformed with joy. He stood, sliding the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then he was kissing her, deep and desperate and full of promise. Evelyn kissed him back, wrapping her arms around his neck, holding him as tightly as he held her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, the sun had set and the first stars were appearing overhead. "I'm building you a home," Clay said, his forehead resting against hers. "Not just fixing up the old ranch house, but building something new. Something that's ours, not mine, or my father's, or anyone else's. A place we can fill with children and laughter and a future I almost gave up hoping for." Evelyn pulled back just enough to see his face. "Children? If you want them. If not, that's all right too. I just want you, Evelyn. However you come, whatever you want our life to look like." "I want children," Evelyn said, and felt the truth of it settle in her chest. "I want to fill that house with noise and chaos and love. I want to build something that lasts." "Then that's what we'll do." They rode back to the ranch in the darkness, the sapphire ring catching starlight on Evelyn's finger. When they arrived, Jake and the ranch hands were waiting on the porch, their faces expectant. "Well?" Jake asked, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Do we have a wedding to plan or what?" Clay looked at Evelyn, and she nodded. "We're getting married," he announced, and the ranch erupted in cheers. The news spread through the valley faster than a summer wildfire. Within days, everyone from Red Hollow to the far ranches knew that Clay Maddox and Evelyn Hart were to be married. The response was overwhelmingly positive. The ranchers who'd come to respect Evelyn's medical skills and admire her courage were thrilled. The women who'd initially judged her as a desperate mail-order bride had softened after seeing how she'd transformed the Circle M and stood beside Clay through the troubles. Even Mrs. Johnson, who'd become something of a friend to Evelyn, declared that it was the best news the valley had heard in years, and immediately began organizing a community celebration. But not everyone was pleased. Prudence Crowell, bitter over her brother's imprisonment and the closure of the store, spread vicious gossip through town. She whispered that Evelyn had planned the whole thing from the beginning, that she'd manipulated Clay, that she was a gold digger who'd trapped a grieving widower, that the marriage was scandalous and improper. Evelyn heard the gossip, of course. In a town as small as Red Hollow, nothing stayed secret for long. But instead of shrinking from it, she faced it head on. One Saturday morning, she rode into town alone and walked straight into the General Mercantile that had opened to replace Crowell's store. The place went silent when she entered, every eye turning to watch her. Prudence was there, examining fabric with two other women who'd been part of her gossip circle. Evelyn walked directly to them, her spine straight and her head high. "Miss Crowell," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "I understand you have concerns about my engagement to Mr. Maddox." Prudence's face went red, then pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. You've been telling anyone who will listen that I'm a fortune hunter, that I trapped Clay, that our marriage is somehow improper." Evelyn's voice was calm, almost conversational. "So I'm going to set the record straight, right here, right now, in front of witnesses." The entire store was listening now, not even pretending to shop. "I came to Red Hollow as a mail-order bride," Evelyn continued. "Your brother promised me security and respect, then changed his mind when I became inconvenient. Clay Maddox offered me honest work when I had nowhere else to go. He treated me with dignity when others treated me with contempt. And over the months I've worked at the Circle M, I've fallen in love with a good man who happens to love me in return." She took a step closer to Prudence, and the older woman actually backed away. "I'm not ashamed of how Clay and I met," Evelyn said. "I'm not ashamed of working for my living or of choosing to marry a man who treats me as an equal. And if you have a problem with that, Miss Crowell, I suggest you examine your own conscience. Because the only person who should be ashamed in this room is the woman whose brother tried to destroy good people for profit." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Mrs. Johnson, who'd been shopping in the corner, started clapping. Slowly, others joined in. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make it clear that Evelyn had more allies than enemies. Prudence's face was purple with rage and humiliation. She grabbed her things and fled the store, the two women who'd been gossiping with her trailing behind uncertainly. After she left, the mercantile owner, a kindly man named Mr. Patterson, who'd always been fair with his prices, approached Evelyn with a smile. "Well said, Miss Hart," he told her. "We're all looking forward to the wedding, and if you need anything, fabric for a dress, supplies for the celebration, you let me know. I'll make sure you get the best prices in the valley." Word of the confrontation spread even faster than the engagement announcement had. By the time Evelyn returned to the Circle M, Clay had already heard 3 different versions of the story. He met her in the ranch yard, his expression a mixture of concern and pride. "Did you really face down Prudence Crowell in front of half the town?" he asked. "I did." "And you told her exactly what you thought of her gossip?" "I did that too." Clay shook his head, that familiar smile tugging at his lips. "You're terrifying, you know that?" "Good," Evelyn said, dismounting. "I'd hate to be predictable." He pulled her into his arms right there in the yard, not caring who saw. "I love you, Evelyn Hart. Your courage, your fire, the way you refuse to let anyone make you feel small." "I learned from the best," she said against his chest. "A certain stubborn rancher who taught me that fighting for what you love is always worth it." The wedding was planned for the first Saturday in October, when the aspens would turn gold and the air would have that perfect autumn crispness. Clay had wanted to marry sooner, but Evelyn insisted on waiting until the new house was finished, or at least habitable. She wanted to wake up in their home as his wife, not as his employee in the old housekeeper's cabin. So the valley rallied once again, this time to help build the Maddox house. Lumber was donated, labor was volunteered, and the structure rose from its foundation with remarkable speed. It wasn't a mansion, just a solid, well-built home with 4 rooms on the main floor and 2 upstairs. But it had large windows to let in the mountain light, a stone fireplace in the main room, a kitchen designed to Evelyn's specifications, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It was perfect. As the house took shape, Evelyn prepared for the wedding. Mrs. Johnson helped her sew a dress from cream-colored silk that missed her. Patterson had ordered special from Denver. It wasn't elaborate. Evelyn had no use for excessive frills, but it was beautiful in its simplicity, with long sleeves and a high collar and delicate embroidery at the cuffs. The ranch hands teased Clay mercilessly about his upcoming nuptials, but their joy for him was genuine. Jake, who'd become something of a father figure to both Clay and Evelyn, took his role as unofficial wedding planner seriously, organizing every detail with military precision. "This is the biggest thing to happen in the valley since the Crowell trial," he declared. "We're going to do it right." 3 days before the wedding, Clay took Evelyn to see the finished house. They rode up in the afternoon, and Evelyn's breath caught when she saw it standing proud against the mountain backdrop. Their house, their future, solid and real and waiting. Clay helped her dismount and led her inside, watching her face as she explored each room. The main room with its massive fireplace and comfortable furniture. The kitchen with its modern stove and deep sink. The bedroom upstairs with windows on 2 sides and a bed that Clay had built himself. "What do you think?" he asked, and she could hear the nervousness in his voice. "I think it's home," Evelyn said, and watched his face light up with relief and joy. That night, Clay gave her a tour of the property around the house, the cleared land where they could plant a garden, the small barn for their personal horses, the path that led down to the creek. As they walked, he shared his vision for the future. "I'm thinking we could expand the medical work you've been doing," he said. "Maybe build a small clinic here, closer to town than the main ranch, somewhere people could come for treatment without having to ride all the way out to the Circle M." Evelyn stared at him. "A clinic? Clay, that would cost—" "We can afford it. With Crowell's store closed, I've been buying supplies at fair prices for the first time in years. The ranch is profitable again, and more importantly, the valley needs someone with your skills. People are already calling you Doc Hart. Might as well make it official." "I'm not a real doctor," Evelyn protested. "I haven't had formal training. You've saved lives, set bones, treated fevers, delivered babies." Clay took her hands. "You've done everything a frontier doctor does, Evelyn. The valley knows it, and they trust you. If you want to do this, I'll support you however I can." Evelyn looked at this man who saw her not as something to be contained or controlled, but as something to be encouraged and celebrated. "Are you sure? A doctor's wife who actually practices medicine? That's not exactly conventional." "When have we ever been conventional?" Clay's smile was warm. "Besides, I didn't fall in love with you because you were conventional. I fell in love with you because you're extraordinary." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with a sky so blue it hurt to look at and air that smelled of pine and falling leaves. The ceremony was held outdoors on the high meadow where Clay had proposed, with the entire valley in attendance. Ranchers and farmers, shopkeepers and homesteaders, the sheriff and his deputies, everyone who'd watched Clay and Evelyn's story unfold. Jake stood beside Clay as his best man, his weathered face suspiciously shiny. Mrs. Johnson stood with Evelyn, her eyes already brimming with tears. The traveling minister who served the valley's scattered churches spoke words about love and partnership and the courage it takes to build a life in hard country. But Evelyn barely heard him. She was too focused on Clay's face, on the way he looked at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever whispered. When it came time for the vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to love you in plenty and in want," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "To stand beside you in triumph and in trial. To honor your strength, celebrate your victories, and hold you through your sorrows. To be your partner in all things, for all the days of my life." Evelyn's voice shook when she spoke her own vows. "I promise to choose you, every day, in every way. To build our future with courage and hope. To weather every storm beside you. To love you not just for who you are, but for who we become together." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Clay kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to more than a few watching eyes. Then they turned to face their community as Mr. and Mrs. Maddox, and the valley erupted in cheers. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Tables laden with food appeared as if by magic, brought by neighbors who'd spent days preparing. There was music, fiddles and guitars and voices raised in song. There was dancing in the meadow grass, children running wild, old men telling stories, and young couples stealing kisses in the shadows. Evelyn danced with Clay, with Jake, with old Mr. Johnson, who'd made a full recovery and insisted on showing her his healed leg. She accepted congratulations and well wishes from people who months ago had looked at her with suspicion and judgment. And she realized that she'd done more than find a husband or a home. She'd found a place where she belonged. As the party wound down and guests began drifting home, Clay pulled Evelyn aside. "Ready to see our wedding present?" "What wedding present?" He led her to a wagon that had been waiting at the edge of the meadow, covered with canvas. When he pulled back the cover, Evelyn gasped. Medical supplies. Boxes and boxes of them. Surgical instruments, medicines, bandages, everything a frontier doctor could need. Far more than she'd accumulated through her own efforts. "Jake helped me order them from Denver," Clay explained. "They arrived yesterday. I had them delivered to the clinic." "What clinic?" Clay's smile was mischievous. "Come with me." They rode through the darkness to the new house, but instead of stopping there, Clay led her to a smaller building Evelyn had noticed being constructed nearby, but had assumed was storage. Inside, he lit lamps to reveal a space that took her breath away. Examination table, cabinets for supplies, a desk for record-keeping, even a small recovery room with 2 beds. Everything was new, clean, ready. "The valley took up a collection," Clay said quietly. "When word got out that I was building you a clinic, people wanted to contribute. Mrs. Johnson donated furniture. Mr. Patterson provided supplies at cost. The other ranchers contributed labor and materials. This isn't just from me, Evelyn. This is from everyone whose life you've touched since you came to Red Hollow." Evelyn walked through the space with tears streaming down her face, running her hands over the smooth cabinets, the sturdy table, the shelves waiting to be filled with medicines and hope. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll use it," Clay said, coming to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Say you'll keep being the extraordinary woman who saves lives and refuses to back down from anything. Say you'll build this dream alongside all our others." "I will," Evelyn said, turning in his arms. "I'll build it all. The clinic, the future, the life we dreamed of. All of it." They stood there in the lamplight, in the clinic that represented everything Evelyn had never dared hope for, and Clay kissed his wife for the first time in their new beginning. Later, much later, they returned to their house, their real home. Clay carried Evelyn over the threshold with careful ceremony, both of them laughing at the tradition, but meaning it all the same. He set her down in the main room, and they stood together looking at the space they'd created. "Do you ever think about where we started?" Evelyn asked. Me standing in Silas's store, humiliated and desperate, and you walking in angry about a shipment? I think about it, Clay admitted. I think about how close we came to never meeting. If I'd gone to the store 5 minutes earlier or later, if I hadn't been angry enough to defend you, if you hadn't been brave enough to accept my offer. I think about how I almost went back east, Evelyn said, how I almost let fear win. But you didn't. You chose courage instead. You chose to trust a stranger, to build something new, to fight for what you wanted. Clay cupped her face in his hands. You chose me, Evelyn, and that choice changed my whole life. You chose me first, Evelyn reminded him, when no one else would. They stood there in the quiet house, holding each other, marveling at the journey that had brought them from a train platform in Red Hollow to this moment, married, in love, with a future spreading before them like the valley itself. In the years that followed, the Maddox house became a landmark in the valley. It was the house where Evelyn Hart Maddox ran her clinic, treating everyone from injured cowboys to fever-stricken children to women in difficult labor. It was the house where Clay built a ranching empire based on fair dealing and honest work, where he mentored young ranchers and stood up for the small operators against anyone who tried to exploit them. It was the house where 3 children were born, 2 boys and a girl, each of them inheriting their mother's stubborn courage and their father's fierce loyalty. It was the house where valley residents gathered for celebrations and crisis councils, where deals were made and friendships forged, where justice was discussed and compassion practiced. It became, in short, the heart of the community. Evelyn's medical practice grew beyond anything she'd imagined. Within 5 years, she'd treated hundreds of patients and earned a reputation that spread far beyond Red Hollow. Doctors from Denver came to consult with her on difficult cases, impressed by her practical knowledge and innovative techniques. The territorial governor himself commended her work in improving health outcomes across the frontier. But despite all the recognition, Evelyn never forgot where she'd started, standing on a train platform with 1 suitcase and no options. She made sure her clinic served everyone regardless of their ability to pay. She trained other women in basic medicine, creating a network of healers across the valley. She fought for better sanitation, for education about disease prevention, for resources to help those who had nothing. Clay watched her work with pride that never diminished. He expanded the ranch, brought in new breeding stock, implemented conservation practices that protected the land for future generations. But his greatest pride was always Evelyn, watching her grow from a desperate mail-order bride into a pillar of the community, a healer, a mother, a force of nature. They had their struggles, of course. No marriage is perfect, no life free from difficulty. There were droughts that tested the ranch, illnesses that tested Evelyn's skills, economic downturns that tested their resilience. They lost Clay's beloved horse to age and Jake to illness, and grieved together. They argued about money and child rearing and where to expand the ranch operations. But through it all, they chose each other. Every single day, they chose partnership over pride, communication over silence, forgiveness over resentment. They built a marriage that was as solid as the house they lived in, as enduring as the mountains that watched over them. 20 years after Evelyn first stepped off that train in Red Hollow, she stood on the porch of her home and watched the sun set over the valley. Her hair showed threads of silver now, and laugh lines creased the corners of her eyes. Her hands, scarred from years of medical work and ranch labor, rested on the porch railing. Clay came to stand beside her, his own hair more gray than dark now, his body bearing the marks of hard work and harder weather. But his eyes were the same storm gray that had caught her attention all those years ago, and when he looked at her, they still held that same fierce tenderness. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I'm thinking about the girl who got off the train that day," Evelyn said. "How scared she was, how certain she was that her life was over. And now? Now I know that sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning." Evelyn leaned into Clay's warmth. That mail-order bride who was rejected by Silas Crowell, she became exactly who she was meant to be. Not in spite of that rejection, but because of it. "You think you would have found this life if Silas had married you?" Clay asked. Evelyn considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I would have been comfortable, maybe, safe, but I wouldn't have become who I am. I wouldn't have discovered my own strength, my own purpose. I wouldn't have built something that mattered." You built more than something that mattered, Evelyn. You built a legacy. She looked out at the valley, at the town of Red Hollow growing in the distance, at the other ranches dotting the landscape, at the clinic that bore her name and served the community she loved. Their oldest son was running the day-to-day operations of the Circle M now, implementing new ideas while honoring old traditions. Their daughter was studying to be a real doctor back east, inspired by her mother's example. Their youngest was still finding his way, but he had time and support and a home that would always welcome him. We built it together, Evelyn corrected. The ranch, the clinic, this life. None of it would exist without both of us. Clay pulled her close, and they stood together watching the stars emerge one by one over the mountains. Below them, lights were beginning to glow in the valley, in houses where families gathered for supper, in the clinic where someone was probably delivering a baby or stitching a wound, in the town that had grown from a rough frontier outpost into a real community. This was the life Evelyn had claimed. Not the one she'd planned for in Philadelphia, not the one promised in Silas's careful letters. This was something she'd built with her own hands and heart, something earned through courage and stubbornness and love. No regrets? Clay asked quietly. Evelyn thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. The loss of her father and the humiliation of poverty, the desperate decision to answer an advertisement, the rejection that had felt like the end of the world, the stranger who'd offered her work when she had nothing, the barn fire and the rustlers and all the struggles they'd faced together. Every hardship, every fear, every moment of uncertainty had been a step on the path to here, to this porch, this man, this life. Not a single one, Evelyn said, and meant it with her whole heart. They stood together as darkness fell and the night sounds of the valley rose around them, the horses in the corrals, the creek murmuring its endless song, the wind in the pines. Inside the house, their youngest called out asking when dinner would be ready. From the clinic, someone was riding up, probably a patient needing help. Life continued, as it always did, full of work and worry and wonderful moments of grace. And Evelyn Hart Maddox, who'd come to Colorado as a desperate mail-order bride with nothing but one suitcase and a broken heart, faced it all with the certain knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, with the man who'd seen her worth when others saw only a commodity, in the home they'd built together, living a life she'd never imagined but couldn't imagine giving up. She'd come west looking for security and found something far more valuable. She'd found herself, and in finding herself, she'd found everything that mattered. As the stars wheeled overhead and the valley settled into sleep, Evelyn smiled and went inside to feed her family, treat her patient, and live the extraordinary life she'd earned. Her train had brought her to Red Hollow all those years ago, but she'd carried herself the rest of the way. And what a journey it had been. What a beautiful, difficult, triumphant journey home.